Welcome to Sheriff Files. Please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. Not every grave is as empty as it looks. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years now, and in all that time, I've learned that the dead don't always stay where you put them. Some folks might call that superstition, but after what I saw in the old section of Hillcrest Cemetery back in '97, I know better than to dismiss what can't be easily explained. The cemetery sits on the eastern edge of town, where the paved roads give way to gravel and the gravel gives way to nothing but wild grass and bramble. Most folks avoid that part of Hillcrest altogether. The newer sections, with their neat rows of polished granite and plastic flowers, those get visitors every Sunday after church. But the old section, what the locals call the Forgotten Quarter, that's different territory entirely. It was late October when I first got word about the disturbances. Mrs. Henley, who lived in the yellow house closest to the cemetery's back fence, called the station 3 mornings in a row. Each time, she complained about the same thing, voices carrying on the wind at night, coming from somewhere beyond her property line. Not words exactly, she said, but the sound of people talking low and urgent, like they were sharing secrets they didn't want overheard. I drove out there the first time on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sun was still high enough to cast sharp shadows between the headstones. The main cemetery looked normal enough. Well-tended paths, fresh flowers on recent graves, the kind of peaceful quiet you'd expect from a place where people came to remember their dead. But as I walked toward the back section, something in the air seemed to shift. The Forgotten Quarter had been neglected for decades. The headstones there were older, dating back to the 1800s, and time had not been kind to them. Many were cracked or tilted at odd angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by weather and neglect. Weeds grew tall between the graves, and poison ivy had claimed whole sections, wrapping around monuments like green fingers. But it was the smell that hit me first. Not the musty odor of old leaves or the sweet decay of autumn, something else entirely. Something that reminded me of warm copper and turned earth, like someone had been digging recently in rich, dark soil. I walked the perimeter that day, checking for signs of vandalism or disturbance. The fence was intact, though rusted in places. No fresh footprints in the soft ground. No evidence of recent digging. Just that strange smell hanging in the air and a feeling I couldn't quite shake, like I was being watched by something that preferred to remain unseen. The second call from Mrs. Henley came 3 days later. This time, she sounded genuinely frightened. The voices, she said, had gotten louder. And there was something else. Lights moving between the trees at the far end of the cemetery, not like flashlights or lanterns, but a soft, warm glow that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. I decided to check it out after dark. The town of Millbrook settles into sleep early most nights, and by 9 o'clock, the streets are usually empty except for the occasional truck heading home from the mill. I parked my cruiser at the cemetery's main gate and walked in with only a heavy flashlight for company. The beam cut through the darkness ahead of me, illuminating patches of weathered stone and tangled vegetation. The newer sections felt normal enough, but as I approached the Forgotten Quarter, that strange sensation returned, stronger this time. The air seemed thicker somehow, harder to breathe. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. In the distance, I could hear the faint rustle of something moving through the underbrush, though there was no wind to speak of. I found the first anomaly near a cluster of headstones that had fallen over decades ago. The stones themselves were unremarkable, worn limestone markers that had once borne names and dates, now smoothed into illegibility by time. But the ground around them felt different under my feet. Softer. Warmer. I knelt down and pressed my palm against the earth. The soil was definitely warm, maybe 10 degrees warmer than it should have been on an October night. Not hot, but noticeable. Like something underneath was generating its own heat. I moved to the next grave over, then the next. Same thing. All of them were warm to the touch, and all of them bore headstones with no readable inscriptions. Blank faces staring up at the stars, marking graves that held secrets they couldn't name. That's when I heard it, a sound like distant conversation, just as Mrs. Henley had described. Not words I could make out, but the unmistakable rhythm of human voices engaged in quiet discussion. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, drifting through the cemetery like smoke. I followed the sound deeper into the forgotten quarter, past monuments so old they seemed to have grown up from the earth itself. My flashlight beams swept across weathered angels and broken urns, across iron fences twisted by decades of frost and thaw. And then, in a clearing at the very back of the cemetery, I found them. 37 graves arranged in 3 rough rows, each marked by a headstone of the same gray limestone. Every stone was blank, not one smooth like the others, but deliberately unmarked, as if whoever had placed them there had chosen anonymity over remembrance. The graves themselves were overgrown with wild grass and bramble, but underneath the vegetation, I could see that the earth had been disturbed more recently than the stones would suggest. I approached the first grave in the front row and knelt beside it. The warmth was more pronounced here, radiating up through the soil like heat from a furnace. I pulled away some of the grass and bramble, revealing earth that was darker and richer than it should have been. When I pressed my ear to the ground, I swear I could hear something like a heartbeat, slow and steady and unmistakably alive. The voices had stopped while I worked, but now they returned, closer than before. I looked up from the grave and saw them, faint points of light moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Not flashlights, too soft and warm for that. More like candle flames, but floating free of any visible source. They bobbed and weaved through the darkness, sometimes disappearing behind trees, sometimes clustering together as if the lights themselves were having a conference. I counted 12 lights in all, moving in what seemed like deliberate patterns around the perimeter of the nameless graves. As I watched, they began to converge on the clearing, drawing closer to where I knelt beside the warm earth. The voices grew louder too, though I still couldn't make out individual words. It was like listening to a conversation in a language I'd once known but had somehow forgotten. I should have left then. Every instinct I'd developed in nearly 4 decades of law enforcement was telling me to get up, walk back to my cruiser, and pretend I'd never seen any of it. But something else held me there. Curiosity, maybe, or the stubborn need to understand what I was witnessing. The lights were only 20 feet away now, close enough that I could see they cast no shadows on the ground beneath them. They pulsed in unison, like a dozen hearts beating to the same rhythm. And with each pulse, the warmth from the graves seemed to intensify, as if the lights and the heated earth were somehow connected. I stood up slowly, my hand resting on the service revolver at my hip. Not that I expected bullets to do much good against whatever this was, but old habits die hard. The lights stopped their advance and hung motionless in the air, as if they were studying me just as intently as I was studying them. That's when I heard my name. Not spoken aloud, but whispered directly into my mind in a voice I recognized but couldn't quite place. A woman's voice, soft and familiar, calling to me from somewhere beyond the floating lights. I took a step toward the sound, then another, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The voice came again, clearer this time, and with it came a memory I'd buried for 30 years. Sarah Millbrook, the mayor's daughter, who disappeared the summer after her high school graduation. We'd searched for weeks, dragged the lake, combed the woods, questioned every drifter and vagrant within 50 miles. Never found so much as a trace of her. But now her voice was calling to me from the darkness beyond the lights, asking me to come closer, to understand what had really happened to her and the others. Because there had been others, hadn't there? People who'd vanished from Millbrook over the years, leaving behind nothing but questions and grief. I took another step forward, and the nearest light drifted toward me, its warm glow illuminating my face. Up close, I could see it wasn't really light at all, but something more like concentrated moonbeam, silvery and soft, and somehow alive. It hovered inches from my face, and I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch it. My hand was halfway extended when I heard the sharp crack of a branch breaking behind me. I spun around, flashlight raised, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Old man Peterson, who'd been the cemetery's caretaker for as long as anyone could remember. He was holding his shotgun, not aimed at me but ready, and his weathered face was grim in the flashlight's glare. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "you need to come away from there. Now." The lights began to pulse faster, and the voices in the darkness grew more urgent. I felt Sarah's presence pulling at me, pleading with me to stay, to listen, to understand. But Peterson was walking toward me now, his boots crunching on fallen leaves, his eyes never leaving the floating lights. "They're not what you think they are," he said when he reached my side. "None of this is what it seems. What are they, Peterson?" He looked at the lights, then at the nameless graves, then back at me. "Bait," he said simply. As if responding to his word, the lights suddenly flared brighter, and the warmth from the graves intensified to an almost unbearable degree. The voices became a chorus of pleading whispers, all calling my name, all promising answers to questions I'd carried for decades. I felt myself taking another step toward them, drawn by needs I didn't fully understand. Peterson's hand closed around my arm. "That's how they get you," he said. "Show you something you've been looking for, something you've been missing. Make you think you found what was lost. Sarah Millbrook is down there," I said, gesturing toward the warm graves. "I can hear her." "Maybe she is," Peterson replied. "But she's not alone. And she's not what she used to be." The lights were circling us now, moving faster, their glow painting everything in that strange silver radiance. The voices were becoming more insistent, and I could feel my resistance crumbling. Whatever was calling to me from beneath those unmarked stones, it wanted me to join it. And part of me, a larger part than I cared to admit, wanted to go. "How long have you known?" I asked Peterson. "Since I was about your age," he said. "My predecessor told me, just like I'm telling you now. Some things in this world are better left alone. Some hungers are too dangerous to feed. But the missing people are gone," he said firmly. "And whatever's wearing their voices now, it's not them. Not anymore." The lights were so close now I could feel their heat on my skin. One of them brushed against my shoulder, and for a moment I saw Sarah Millbrook as clearly as if she were standing in front of me. Young and beautiful and unchanged by the 30 years since her disappearance. She was smiling and holding out her hand, inviting me to follow her down into the warm earth where questions would finally have answers. Peterson's shotgun roared once, the muzzle flashed blazing bright in the darkness. The nearest light flickered and went out, and the others immediately pulled back, their glow dimming. The voices faded to whispers, then to nothing at all. "Rock salt," Peterson explained, ejecting the spent shell. "Won't kill them, but it gets their attention." We stood there in the sudden silence, watching as the remaining lights retreated to the edge of the clearing. The warmth from the graves was already beginning to fade, and the air was starting to smell normal again, just autumn leaves and old stone and the lingering scent of gunpowder. "This happens every few years," Peterson said. "When they get hungry enough." Used to be worse, back when the town was smaller and people were more likely to wander around alone at night. No. He shrugged. Folks mostly stay away from this part of the cemetery. Mostly. What are they? Don't rightly know, he admitted. Been here longer than the town, probably longer than the cemetery. The headstones were blank when they were first placed. No names, no dates, nothing to mark who or what was buried underneath. But they were put there for a reason, to mark something that needed marking. And every now and then, what's underneath gets restless. I looked back at the nameless graves, now just mounds of cooling earth in the darkness. And you've been keeping watch all these years? Someone has to, Peterson said. It's a responsibility that gets passed down from one caretaker to the next. Like I said, some things are better left alone. We walked back toward the main cemetery together, leaving the forgotten quarter to its eternal secrets. Behind us, I could see the lights beginning to move again, but they stayed at the edge of the clearing, no longer approaching. They seemed to understand that this encounter was over, at least for now. Peterson stopped at the cemetery gate and turned to me. You won't be able to forget what you saw tonight, he said. But you can choose not to go looking for it again. That's the choice everyone gets once. After that, he gestured back toward the darkness we'd left behind. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. What happens when you're too old to keep watch? I'll find someone, he said. Someone who can handle the responsibility. Someone who understands that some hungers are older and stronger than we are, and the best we can do is make sure they don't spread. That was almost 30 years ago now. Peterson passed away last winter, and before he died, he came to see me one final time. He didn't say much, just handed me a key to the cemetery's back gate, and told me I'd know what to do with it when the time came. Mrs. Henley called the station last week. She'd been hearing voices again, she said. Voices carrying on the wind at night, coming from somewhere beyond her property line. And she'd seen lights moving between the trees at the far end of the cemetery. Not flashlights or lanterns, but a soft, warm glow that pulsed with its own rhythm. I told her I'd look into it. Tonight, when the town settles into sleep and the streets empty out, I'll drive out to Hillcrest Cemetery with Peterson's key in my pocket and his shotgun on the seat beside me. I'll walk past the newer sections, with their neat rows of polished granite and plastic flowers, and make my way to the forgotten quarter where the headstones bear no names and some graves still feel warm. Because not every grave is as empty as it looks, and some responsibilities can't be passed along to someone else. Some things you have to carry yourself, whether you want to or not. The dead don't always stay where you put them. But with the right kind of watching, the right kind of understanding, sometimes you can make sure they don't wander too far from home. We called them ghost lights. We should have called them bait. 37 years I wore the badge in Millbrook County, and in all that time, there were only two things that could make grown men refuse to work the night shift: the abandoned Kresge farmhouse out on Township Road, and those dancing lights in the marsh. Most folks around here have learned to live with peculiar things. You'd get used to the way certain hollows hold on to winter longer than they should, or how some wells run backward during the new moon. But the marsh lights were different. They had a hunger to them. The marsh stretched for maybe 3 miles along the eastern edge of town, where Millbrook Creek widened into something that wasn't quite a lake but was too deep and still to be called a stream. My grandfather used to say the water there was older than the town, older than the county, maybe older than the state itself. He wasn't wrong. When they built the railroad through here in 1887, they had to reroute the tracks twice because the original survey team kept disappearing. Not dying, mind you. Disappearing. Their equipment would be found days later, arranged in perfect circles on the marsh banks, compasses all pointing inward toward the deepest part of the water. The lights started showing up about 15 years into my tenure as sheriff. Or maybe they'd always been there, and folks had just gotten better at pretending they weren't. They appeared most often on humid August nights, when the air hung thick as syrup and the katydids went quiet for no reason anyone could explain. Small orbs of pale green light, no bigger than mason jars, drifting maybe 6 feet above the marsh grass. They moved with purpose, not random like fireflies or marsh gas. They had patterns, routes they favored. Sometimes they'd cluster together like they were having a conversation. Other times they'd spread out in formation, like they were searching for something. People started calling my office about them in the summer of '89. Mrs. Henley from Elm Street said they'd been keeping her awake, bobbing outside her bedroom window. The Kowalski boy claimed he'd seen one hovering over his fishing spot, watching him bait his hook. But it was Tommy Vess who first told me they were following people. Tommy was a good kid, maybe 16, worked weekends at Brennan's Hardware. He came into the station on a Thursday morning in late August, hat in his hands, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. His mother had sent him, he said, because she was worried he was losing his mind. "Sheriff," he started, then stopped, staring at his boots. "Sheriff, I think something in the marsh wants me to come closer." I'd heard stranger things, so I let him talk. He'd been walking home from his girlfriend's house Tuesday night, taking the long way around the marsh because it was cooler by the water. The lights had appeared when he was maybe 50 yards from the marsh edge, 3 of them strung out in a line like lanterns marking a path. They'd paced him as he walked, staying just ahead, bobbing gently in the thick air. "At first I thought it was kind of pretty," Tommy said. "Like Christmas lights, you know? But then I realized they were leading me somewhere. Every time I slowed down, they'd slow down. When I stopped, they'd stop too, just hanging there, waiting." He'd followed them for maybe a quarter mile before something in his gut told him to turn around. When he looked back, he could see more lights emerging from deeper in the marsh, dozens of them, forming a semicircle behind him. They weren't trying to surround him, exactly. They were hurting him. Tommy had run then, sprinting back toward town with the lights trailing behind him like a comet's tail. They'd followed him all the way to Brennan Street before finally turning back toward the marsh. But the worst part, he said, was the sound they made when they retreated. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. The marsh had gone completely silent. No frogs, no insects, no night birds. Just the wet whisper of the lights moving through the cattails. I drove out to the marsh that evening after my shift, parked the cruiser on the shoulder of County Road 12 where it curves closest to the water. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood, and the marsh stretched out before me like a bowl of dark honey. I'd brought binoculars and a thermos of coffee, figuring I'd keep watch for a few hours, see what all the fuss was about. The lights appeared just after 10 o'clock. They rose from the marsh like bubbles of phosphorescence, slow and deliberate. 5 of them at first, then 8, then more than I could count. They moved in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, weaving between the cattails and cypress stumps in graceful loops and spirals. Beautiful in their way. Hypnotic. I watched them for maybe 20 minutes before I realized they were getting closer to the road. Not moving toward me directly, but advancing in a slow, patient curve that would eventually bring them to where I sat. That's when I noticed the silence Tommy had mentioned. The marsh had become a void of sound, as if something had reached out and turned off the volume on the entire world. I started the engine and drove home. The next day, I called the county extension office and spoke to a fellow named Morrison who specialized in wetland ecology. He listened politely as I described the lights, then suggested they were probably foxfire, bioluminescent bacteria that sometimes grew on decaying vegetation in swampy areas. Perfectly natural, he assured me. Nothing to worry about. But Morrison had never seen the way these lights moved, had never watched them respond to human presence like curious animals, had never felt the weight of their attention. The disappearances started 2 weeks later. First was Janet Holloway, a real estate agent from over in Grantsville who'd been showing property along the marsh. Her car was found parked at the end of Fisherman's Lane, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. Her footprints led from the car to the marsh bank, then stopped abruptly at the water's edge, as if she'd simply stepped into thin air. We dragged the marsh for 3 days. Brought in divers from the state police. Found nothing but old tires and fishing tackle. The water was deeper than anyone had expected. In some places, the divers couldn't find bottom. But there was no sign of Janet Holloway. 3 days after that, it was Carl Detmer, a local hunting guide who knew the marsh better than anyone. His John boat was discovered floating empty near the old railway bridge, oars shipped, tackle box still open on the seat. Carl's hunting rifle was there too, unfired, which didn't make sense. Carl had shot his first deer at age 8, and could put a bullet through a dime at 50 yards. If something had threatened him, he would have fought back. The lights appeared over Carl's boat that night. I saw them myself, called out to the scene by a fisherman who'd spotted the empty vessel. 7 pale orbs hovering directly above the abandoned John boat, casting their sickly glow on the dark water. They stayed there for hours, motionless as mourners at a graveside, before finally drifting back into the deeper parts of the marsh. By September, people had stopped going near the water after dark. The few businesses along Marsh Road, Krensky's Bait Shop, the Sunset Diner, Murphy's Boat Rental, started closing early. Parents kept their children inside once the sun went down. Even the teenagers, who'd been sneaking out to the marsh to drink beer and make out since before I was born, found other places to spend their Friday nights. But the lights kept appearing. If anything, they seemed to be growing stronger, brighter. And they were venturing further from the water, following the creek beds and drainage ditches that led into town. Mrs. Patterson on Elm Street reported finding her garden gate open 3 mornings in a row, with strange burn marks in the grass leading from the gate to her back door. The Henderson's dog, a German shepherd named Buck who never shown fear of anything in his life, started howling every night around 11 o'clock, staring fixedly at the eastern edge of their property where the land sloped down toward the marsh. I was starting to think we might need to call in the state police, maybe even the FBI, when Mary Catherine Brennan walked into my office on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. Mary Catherine was old when I was young, and by then she must have been pushing 90. She'd been born in Millbrook County, and had never lived anywhere else, had seen it change from farmland to suburbs to whatever it was becoming now. Her family had owned land along the marsh for 5 generations before selling it to the county for the nature preserve. If anyone knew the history of that place, it would be Mary Catherine. She sat in the chair across from my desk like she had all the time in the world, her gnarled hands folded over the handle of her walking stick. She wore a black dress that looked like it belonged in a museum, and her pale blue eyes were sharp as broken glass. "Sheriff," she said without preamble, "you need to know what's under that water." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm listening." "My great-grandfather helped build the first sawmill here in 1851, she began. "Back then, what you call the marsh was just a bend in Millbrook Creek, maybe 3 feet deep at its deepest point. Good place for baptisms and washing clothes. Children used to swim there in the summer." She paused, studying my face. "You know what changed it?" I shook my head. "Railroad company needed ballast for the new tracks they were laying. Gravel and stone to pack under the rails. They decided to quarry it from the hills just north of the creek bend." Her voice grew softer, more deliberate. "What they didn't know was that those hills were burial mounds. Effigy mounds. My great-grandfather saw them dig up the first grave, a child maybe 8 years old, buried with beads and pottery and copper ornaments. Beautiful things. Sacred things. She shifted in her chair, the leather creaking like old bones. The railroad bosses didn't care. They kept digging. Disturbed maybe 200 graves, scattered the bones like they were nothing more than rocks. Used the sacred earth to build their railroad. And the water? I asked. Rose that winter. Creek backed up like something was blocking it downstream, though nobody could ever find an obstruction. Kept rising until it covered the places where the graves had been. By spring, it was deep enough to drown a horse. Mary Catherine's eyes held mine. The Potawatomi who used to visit the burial ground stopped coming. Said the water had gone bad. Said the ancestors were angry. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. They had a word for spirits who died violently, Sheriff. Spirits who couldn't find rest. They called them Winnebago, the hungry ghosts. Always searching for what was taken from them. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the case files spread out before me, trying to make sense of what Mary Catherine had told me. Railroad records from the 1880s confirmed her story. The company had indeed quarried stone from the hills north of Millbrook Creek. There were even newspaper accounts of Indian relics being discovered during the excavation, though they were dismissed as artifacts of minor historical significance. But it was a handwritten note in the margin of one of the railroad supervisor's reports that made my blood run cold. Work crews report strange lights appearing near quarry site after dark. Men refused night shifts. Project delayed indefinitely. The lights had been there from the beginning. They weren't some recent phenomenon caused by chemicals or bacteria or natural gas. They were old. Old as the bones that had been scattered to build the railroad. Old as the graves that now lay beneath 30 feet of dark water. I made my decision that night. I was going to the marsh. I waited until the following Saturday, when the weather forecast called for clear skies and no moon. I wanted to see the lights at their brightest, to understand what they were and what they wanted. I loaded my service revolver and clipped a flashlight to my belt, then drove out to County Road 12. The marsh looked different at night. Larger somehow, as if the darkness had stretched its boundaries. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a sheet of black glass. I parked at the same spot where I'd watched the lights before and settled in to wait. They appeared just after midnight. This time there were dozens of them, rising from the water in perfect silence. They arranged themselves in 2 long lines extending out from the marsh toward the road, like an honor guard or a procession. They hung motionless in the humid air, casting their pale green glow on the cattails and cypress stumps. I watched them for maybe 10 minutes before I realized they were waiting for me. The thought came from nowhere, sudden and certain as a lightning strike. They knew I was there. They'd been expecting me. The neat rows of lights weren't random. They were an invitation. Or a challenge. I got out of the cruiser. The moment my feet hit the asphalt, the lights began to move. Not toward me, but away, retreating slowly into the marsh while maintaining their formation. They were leading me somewhere, just as they'd led Tommy Vess and Janet Holloway and Carl Detmer. Just as they'd probably led every person who'd ever vanished near these waters. I followed them. The ground at the marsh edge was softer than I'd expected, my boots sinking into the mud with wet sucking sounds. The air smelled of decay and stagnant water, but underneath those familiar marsh odors was something else, something sharp and metallic, like the smell of old blood or rusted iron. The lights stayed maybe 20 yards ahead of me, bobbing gently above the water. When I moved, they moved. When I stopped, they stopped. They were patient, these things. They had all the time in the world. I followed them deeper into the marsh, stepping from tussock to tussock, using the gnarled roots of cypress trees to keep my balance. The water grew deeper and darker, and soon I was wading through knee-deep pools that reflected the lights like scattered stars. My flashlight beams seemed weak and insignificant against the soft green glow that surrounded me. That's when I heard the voices. Whispers at first, so faint I thought they might be the wind moving through the cattails. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, heavy as a held breath. The whispers grew clearer as I moved deeper into the marsh, resolving into words I couldn't quite understand. They seemed to come from the water itself, rising like bubbles from the depths. The lights stopped moving. I found myself in a circular clearing where the water was deepest, surrounded by a ring of ancient cypress trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead. The lights had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around me, maybe 30 of them, hanging at eye level like glowing fruit. And then I saw them. Shapes moving beneath the water. Pale forms drifting just below the surface, arms outstretched, faces turned upward toward the lights. They weren't swimming, they were floating, suspended in the dark water like specimens in formaldehyde. Men and women and children, their clothes rotting away, their flesh bloated and white. But their eyes were open. All of them. Staring up at me with expressions of infinite hunger. I tried to back away, but my feet had sunk deep into the marsh bottom. The mud held me like quicksand, and every movement only drove me deeper. The water around my legs was growing warmer, and I could feel something brushing against my boots, fingers, maybe, or the trailing ends of burial shrouds. The whispers became a chorus, voices speaking in unison from the depths. Come down to us. Come down and rest. Come down and help us remember. One of the floating figures began to rise, breaking the surface of the water with a sound like tearing silk. It had once been a woman, I think, though the years underwater had changed her into something else. Her hair floated around her head like seaweed, and her skin had taken on the same pale green glow as the lights above. When she opened her mouth to speak, dark water poured out. You know us, she said, her voice like the sound of wind through empty rooms. You've always known us. We are the scattered ones. The forgotten ones. The ones whose rest was stolen. More figures began to surface, rising from the depths with slow, deliberate movements. Men in the rotted remains of work clothes. Children still clutching toys that had dissolved into shapeless masses. All of them reaching toward me with waterlogged fingers. Help us remember, they pleaded in voices like rustling leaves. Help us find what was taken. Help us rest. The lights began to descend, settling onto the surface of the water like lily pads. Where they touched, the water glowed with that same sickly phosphorescence. The floating dead moved toward the lights, pressing their faces against the glowing orbs like moths to flame. And I understood. The lights weren't separate from the dead, they were part of them. The ghostly illumination came from within, from whatever spark of consciousness still burned in those waterlogged corpses. They were the souls of the people buried in the mounds, the ones whose graves had been desecrated to build the railroad. They'd been trying to return to their resting place for over a century, but the water had trapped them, held them in a state between life and death. And everyone who disappeared, Janet Holloway, Carl Detmer, all the others, they'd become part of the collective, adding their own light to the constellation of the lost. No, I whispered, and somehow found the strength to pull one foot free from the sucking mud. No, I won't. The woman who had first risen from the water tilted her head like a curious bird. You cannot leave, she said gently. You have seen us. You know our names. You are part of our story now. But I kept struggling, fighting against the mud and the hands that grabbed at my legs from below. My flashlight had gone out, leaving only the ghostly green glow of the marsh lights to see by. The dead pressed closer, their waterlogged faces turned up toward me with expressions of desperate longing. "Please," one of them whispered, a man in a railroad worker's cap, his face caved in on one side where it had been crushed by falling stone. "Please help us go home." I almost gave in then. The exhaustion was overwhelming, and part of me wanted nothing more than to slip beneath the dark water and join their eternal vigil. It would be peaceful, I thought. Restful. No more cases to solve, no more mysteries to unravel. Just the quiet darkness of the deep water and the soft green light of the marsh. Instead, I drew my service revolver and fired 3 shots into the air. The gunshots shattered the otherworldly silence like hammer blows. The lights flickered and dimmed, and the dead sank back beneath the surface with sounds of regret and sorrow. For a moment, the marsh was just a marsh again, dark water and muddy banks and the normal sounds of night insects. I used that moment to fight my way back to solid ground, half running, half crawling through the shallows until I reached the road. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the lights were following me, but I could feel them watching as I drove away. That was 23 years ago. I retired the following spring and moved to Arizona, where the air is dry and there's no water deep enough to hide secrets. But I still dream about the marsh sometimes, about the pale faces staring up from the depths and the soft green lights that dance above dark water. The lights are still there, according to the reports that reach me from my replacement. Still appearing on humid August nights, still leading the curious and the unwary deeper into the marsh. 3 more people have vanished since I left: a bird watcher from the university, a couple of teenagers who ignored their parents' warnings, and just last month, a paranormal investigator who came to town with cameras and electronic equipment, convinced he could document the phenomenon. They found his cameras on the marsh bank, arranged in a perfect circle, all pointing toward the deepest part of the water. The memory cards were blank except for a single image on each one, a pale green light floating just above the camera lens, as if it had been posing for the photograph. The county has put up warning signs now, declaring the marsh off-limits after dark. But signs won't stop the lights from calling, and they won't keep people from following when they hear the whispers on the wind. We called them ghost lights, those soft green orbs that danced above the dark water. We should have called them bait. Because that's what they were, lures cast by patient fishermen who had all eternity to wait for the next curious soul to take a step too close to the water's edge. And somewhere beneath 30 feet of stagnant water, in the place where sacred graves once rested in peace, they're still waiting. Still calling. Still hungry for someone to help them remember their names and find their way home to a rest that was stolen from them over a century ago. The railroad is long gone now, tracks pulled up and sold for scrap decades ago. But the damage it did remains, buried beneath the dark water of Millbrook Marsh. And on humid August nights, when the air hangs thick as syrup and the katydids go quiet for no reason anyone can explain, you can still see the lights rising from the depths, beautiful and patient and hungry as the day they died. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. And some lights aren't meant to be followed, no matter how beautiful they appear or how sweetly they seem to call your name. I learned that lesson in Millbrook Marsh, and I've carried it with me every day since. But sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when sleep won't come, I wonder if I left something unfinished back there in the dark water. Wonder if those pale faces are still staring up through 30 feet of black water, waiting for someone to help them find their way home. And I wonder if, someday, they might decide to come looking for me. A Sheriff Paranormal Files story. Some roads want you to stay on them. This one never lets you leave. That's what old Ezra Whitman told me 43 years ago, standing in my office with his weathered hands shaking like autumn leaves. I was younger then, still believed that badges and common sense could solve anything that walked, crawled, or stumbled through the boundaries of Cedar Hollow. Ezra's words didn't mean much to me at the time. Should have listened closer. The trail he was talking about runs along the eastern ridge, just past where the Blackwood Creek takes that sharp bend toward the old mill foundations. Most folks around here know better than to walk it alone, though they can't rightly say why. Their grandfathers knew, and their grandfathers before that. Knowledge gets passed down in small towns like ours, not through books or formal learning, but through the careful way people avoid certain places when the sun gets low. It started with the Hendricks boy, Tommy, 15 years old and built like a scarecrow, all elbows and knees and that particular brand of teenage stupidity that makes boys think they're bulletproof. He'd been taking that ridge trail to get to his girlfriend's house on Maple Street, cutting through the woods instead of walking the long way around town. Smart enough to save 20 minutes. Not smart enough to pay attention to what those woods were trying to tell him. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Tommy showed up at his girlfriend's house looking pale as cemetery marble, talking nonsense about how the trail had gotten shorter. Said he'd been timing his walks, and what used to take him 35 minutes now only took 20. The girl's mother called me, worried the boy was using drugs or having some kind of breakdown. I found Tommy sitting on the front steps of the diner, staring at his watch like it had personally betrayed him. His clothes were damp with dew and there were spider webs caught in his hair, though he swore he hadn't left the trail. "Sheriff," he said when he saw me coming. "Something's wrong with the woods." I asked him what he meant by that, and he just kept shaking his head, running his fingers through that sandy hair of his. "The trail's getting shorter. Every day, it's shorter." Now, I've heard plenty of stories in my time. Stories about lights that dance between the trees on moonless nights. About voices calling from deep in the woods that sound exactly like your dead relatives. Cedar Hollow's got more ghost stories than it has living residents, seems like. But a trail that changes length? That was a new one. I walked Tommy home and told his mother to keep an eye on him. Then I drove out to the ridge myself. The trailhead sits just off Route 14, marked by two massive white oaks that have been standing there since before the town was incorporated. Someone had nailed a weathered wooden sign to one of them years ago. Ridge Trail 2.3 miles. The paint was faded and peeling, but the numbers were still readable. I'd walked that trail myself plenty of times over the years, usually hunting deer or investigating reports of teenagers drinking in the woods. It was a pleasant enough walk, winding through second-growth forest with occasional clearings where the old logging roads intersected. Nothing unusual about it, except for the way the trees seemed to lean in closer as you got deeper into the woods, and how the bird song always seemed to come from somewhere else, never quite where you were looking. That first day, I timed the walk. Took me exactly 47 minutes to reach the end, where the trail dumped out onto Maple Street. On the way back, I paid closer attention to the landscape, looking for anything that might explain Tommy's confusion. The path was well-worn and easy to follow, marked with the occasional splash of orange paint on the tree trunks. Nothing seemed out of place. But as I was walking back toward my patrol car, I noticed something odd. The afternoon shadows were falling differently than they had on my way in. Not dramatically different, just enough to make me pause and look around. The light filtering through the canopy had taken on that golden quality you get in late autumn, even though it was still early in the season. I checked my watch. The return trip had taken 51 minutes. 4 minutes longer than the walk-in. Could have been my imagination, or maybe I just walked slower on the way back. I made a note in my logbook and filed it away as one of those small mysteries that don't amount to much. Tommy came to see me again 3 days later. This time, He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were sunken and red-rimmed, and his hands had developed a persistent tremor. "It's down to 15 minutes now," he whispered, glancing around my office like something might be listening. 15 minutes to walk what used to take more than half an hour." I leaned back in my chair and studied the boy. "Tommy, when was the last time you got a good night's sleep?" "You don't believe me." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Nobody believes me. But I'll prove it to you, Sheriff. Come walk with me tonight." "Tonight?" "Has to be at night. That's when it's longest. During the day, it keeps getting shorter. But at night—" He trailed off, staring at something I couldn't see. "At night what, son?" "At night, it doesn't want to let you reach the end." The way he said it made something cold settle in my chest. I'd been sheriff of Cedar Hollow for 12 years by then, and I'd learned to trust my instincts about people. Tommy Hendricks wasn't lying. He wasn't having a breakdown. He was scared, bone-deep scared, of something he couldn't properly explain. I agreed to meet him at the trailhead that evening. The sun was just touching the horizon when I pulled up beside Tommy's battered pickup truck. The boy was standing between the two oak trees, fidgeting with a stopwatch and checking his phone every few seconds. He brought a flashlight, one of those heavy-duty models that hunters use, and he was wearing a thick jacket despite the evening being warm. "You ready for this, Sheriff?" I nodded and checked my own watch. 7:47 p.m. The trail looked different at dusk. The trees seemed taller, more densely packed, and the path itself appeared narrower than I remembered. Our footsteps sounded muffled, as if the forest was absorbing the sound before it could travel very far. Tommy walked ahead of me, moving with the confidence of someone who'd made this trip many times, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. About 10 minutes in, I started to notice the smell. It was subtle at first, like damp earth and rotting leaves, which wasn't unusual for a forest trail. But as we walked deeper, it grew stronger and more distinct. Sweet, almost cloying, with an undertone of something metallic. Like flowers left too long in a vase, mixed with the taste of old pennies. Tommy stopped walking and turned to face me. In the beam of his flashlight, his face looked waxy and pale. "Do you smell that?" I nodded. "It gets stronger the further we go." "And Sheriff?" He paused, listening to something I couldn't hear. "We've been walking for almost an hour now." I checked my watch. 8:52 p.m. He was right. We'd been walking for over an hour, and by my estimate, we should have reached Maple Street 20 minutes ago. The trail ahead of us curved away into darkness, showing no sign of ending. "How much further?" I asked. Tommy's laugh had a hysterical edge to it. "I don't know. Last night, I walked for 3 hours before I turned back. Never did see the end." We kept walking. The smell grew stronger, and other things began to change. The trees around us were wrong, somehow. Still oaks and maples and birches, but they seemed older, more gnarled, with bark that looked almost black in our flashlight beams. The underbrush was thicker too, pressing in closer to the trail, and I started to notice flowers blooming in the darkness. Pale, luminescent blooms that had no business flowering in September, or at night, or possibly anywhere in the natural world. The path beneath our feet felt different as well. Softer, more yielding, like we were walking on something organic rather than packed earth. When I knelt down and shone my light on the ground, I could see what looked like a network of fine roots or veins running just beneath the surface. "We should head back," I told Tommy. But when we turned around, the trail behind us had changed too. What should have been a gentle downward slope was now a steep incline, disappearing up into darkness that our lights couldn't penetrate. The distance we just covered, the landmarks we'd passed, all of it was gone. Tommy was breathing hard now, fighting panic. "This is what happens. This is what I was trying to tell you. It doesn't want us to leave." I put my hand on his shoulder, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. "Easy, son. We'll figure this out." But even as I said it, I could hear something moving in the woods around us. Not the small sounds of nocturnal animals, but something larger, something that seemed to be keeping pace with us. Branches cracking under weight, the soft whisper of something large moving through the underbrush. Whatever it was, it stayed just outside the reach of our lights. We started walking again, back the way we'd come, but the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. The incline grew steeper, and the smell grew stronger, until it was almost overwhelming. Sweet and rotten and metallic, like a florist's shop built over a slaughterhouse. Then Tommy stopped walking and grabbed my arm. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual. Then, gradually, I became aware of a sound that might have been wind through the trees, except there was no wind. It was a sighing, breathing sound, as if the forest itself was inhaling and exhaling. And underneath that, something else. Something that sounded almost like whispering. The voices were too distant and distorted to make out words, but they seemed to be coming from all around us. Sometimes they sounded like children calling to their parents. Sometimes like lovers murmuring endearments. Sometimes like old friends sharing secrets. Tommy was shaking beside me. "They want us to stay," he said. "They want us to become part of it." I don't know how long we walked after that. Time seemed to have lost its meaning on that trail. My watch had stopped at 9:15, and Tommy's phone had died completely. We just kept moving, following the path that led always upward, always deeper into woods that couldn't possibly exist in the daylight world. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I started to recognize some of the voices. My father, who'd been dead for 8 years. My high school sweetheart, who'd moved to California and never looked back. People I'd known, people I'd lost, people I'd tried to forget. All of them calling to me from the darkness between the trees. "Don't listen," I told Tommy, but my own voice sounded strange and distant. "Whatever they say, don't listen." The boy nodded, but I could see him starting to slow down, starting to turn his head toward the sounds. The voices were getting to him, just like they were getting to me. Part of me wanted to step off the trail, to push through the luminescent flowers and find whoever was calling my name so sweetly, so urgently. That's when I saw the light ahead. It wasn't the warm, electric glow of street lights or house windows. This was something colder, more blue-white, like moonlight filtered through ice. But it was definitely the end of the trail, the end of this nightmare walk through woods that shouldn't exist. We stumbled toward it, half running now, desperate to escape whatever was hunting us through the trees. The whispers rose to a crescendo behind us, angry now, disappointed. Something large crashed through the underbrush to our left, keeping pace but never quite catching up. Then we burst out of the tree line and found ourselves standing on Maple Street, gasping and shaking under the familiar glow of the street lamps. Tommy's girlfriend's house was right there, exactly where it should be, windows lit and welcoming. I checked my watch. It was working again, showing 10:23 p.m. We'd been walking for 2.5 hours. Tommy collapsed on the sidewalk, sobbing with relief. I helped him to his feet and walked him to the door, where his girlfriend and her parents were waiting, worried sick. They said they'd been calling his phone for hours. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had happened. By the time I reached my house, I'd almost convinced myself it had been some kind of shared hallucination, maybe caused by gas leaking from an old mine shaft or some kind of natural phenomenon I didn't understand. But the next morning, I drove back to the trailhead to walk it again in daylight. The trail was exactly 2.3 miles long, just like the sign said. It took me 47 minutes to walk from end to end, same as it always had. Nothing unusual about it at all, except for the flowers I found growing beside the path. Pale, luminescent blooms that should have been impossible in September daylight, but there they were. And the smell. Even in broad daylight, with the sun shining through the canopy and birds singing in the trees, I could still smell that sweet, rotten, metallic odor. Fainter than it had been at night, but definitely there. I never saw Tommy Hendricks again after that night. His family moved away a week later, sudden-like, without much explanation. Just packed up and left town like something was chasing them. Maybe something was. But I kept walking that trail, kept timing it, kept making notes in my logbook. During the day, it was always the same. 2.3 miles, 47 minutes, beginning to end. But at night? At night, it was different. Some nights, it was only slightly longer than normal. An hour, maybe an hour and a half. Other nights, especially when the moon was dark and the air was still, it seemed to go on forever. I learned to turn back when my watch hit the 2-hour mark, learned to ignore the voices that called to me from the deeper woods. I never told anybody else about what I found on that trail. What would be the point? Who would believe in old sheriff's stories about a path that changes length depending on the time of day? Who would understand that some places in this world don't follow the rules the rest of us have to live by? But I kept records. 43 years worth of records, documenting every walk, every timing, every strange thing I encountered on that ridge trail. I've got notebooks full of observations about the flowers that bloom in darkness, about the way the trees seem to move when you're not looking directly at them, about the voices that whisper from just beyond the reach of your flashlight. And I've got theories, too. Theories about what that place really is, about what it wants from the people who walk its path. I think it's hungry, that trail. Hungry for time, hungry for the lives of anyone foolish enough to venture too deep into its embrace. I think it feeds on the minutes and hours it steals from us, growing stronger and longer with every soul that gets lost in its darkness. The town council wanted to close the trail a few years back, after a hiker went missing somewhere along its length. They asked my opinion, as sheriff, about whether it was safe to leave open. I told them it would be better to leave it alone. Some things you don't disturb. Some places you just learn to avoid. The trail's still there, still marked by those 2 white oaks and that faded wooden sign. Most folks know better than to walk it after dark. The smart ones don't walk it at all. But every now and then, someone new comes to town. Someone who doesn't know the stories, doesn't understand the warnings. Someone young and foolish and convinced they can handle whatever the woods might throw at them. When that happens, I try to talk them out of it. I try to explain, in my careful way, that some roads want you to stay on them, and this one never lets you leave. Most of the time, they listen. Sometimes they don't. And on those nights when the moon is dark and the air is still, when I'm lying in bed listening to the wind in the trees, I swear I can still hear them calling. Voices drifting down from the ridge, from that trail that gets shorter during the day and longer after dark. New voices joining the old ones, whispering promises and pleading for company, begging someone, anyone, to come walk with them in the darkness between the trees. Some roads want you to stay on them. This one never lets you leave. And 43 years later, I still check my locks twice before I go to sleep. They weren't cawing. They were speaking. That's what I told myself 37 years ago, standing in the middle of Elm Street at 3:17 in the afternoon on October 13th, listening to what had to be 100 black birds perched in old Moses Hartwell's oak tree. The tree that had been dead for 15 years, mind you. Dead as cemetery dirt, but still standing there like some monument to stubbornness, right in front of the Hartwell place that nobody had lived in since Moses took his shotgun to the cellar back in '72. I'd been sheriff of Millbrook for 11 years by then. 11 years of drunk and disorderlies, domestic disputes, the occasional break-in at Murphy's hardware store. Small-town problems for a small-town man. But what I heard coming from that tree made my badge feel like a child's toy pinned to my chest. The voices were clear as Sunday morning church bells. A woman calling for her cat. A man asking about the weather. Children reciting nursery rhymes in perfect unison. All of it coming from birds that sat motionless as carved obsidian, their black eyes reflecting the pale October sun like tiny mirrors of hell. I'd gotten the call from Mrs. Pemberton around noon. She lived 2 houses down from the Hartwell place, been there since the Eisenhower administration, and in all those years I'd never known her to call the sheriff's office for anything more serious than teenagers toilet papering her rose bushes. But there was something in her voice that made me put down my coffee and drive over myself instead of sending Deputy Carson. "Sheriff," she'd said, and her voice was thin as paper. "Something ain't right with them birds." When I pulled up to Elm Street, I could see what she meant. The oak tree was black with crows, more than I'd ever seen in one place. They covered every branch, every twig, packed in so tight it looked like the tree had grown a new kind of bark. But they weren't making a sound. Just sitting there, watching the street with those bright dark eyes. Mrs. Pemberton was waiting on her porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had probably gone cold an hour ago. She was a small woman, bent with arthritis and age, but she'd always had steel in her spine. Today, though, she looked shrunken, like something had sucked the substance right out of her. "How long they been like this?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Sound seemed to carry differently on Elm Street, like the air itself was holding its breath. "Since dawn," she whispered. "Came in all at once, like someone had called them. Haven't moved since, 'cept to turn their heads when folks walk by." I looked back at the tree. Sure enough, every single bird was facing our direction now, hundreds of black heads turned toward us in perfect synchronization. The sight made my skin crawl like fire ants were marching up and down my spine. That's when they started talking. It began with just one voice, high and sweet, like a little girl calling for her mother. "Mama? Mama, where are you?" Then another joined in, deeper, gravelly, asking about the price of grain at Morrison's feed store. Then more voices, layering over each other but somehow still distinct, like listening to a dozen conversations at once in a crowded restaurant. But these weren't conversation fragments. These were voices I recognized. The little girl was Lucy Morrison, who'd disappeared from her backyard in 1963. The man asking about grain was Tom Fletcher, who died in a car accident the previous winter. The woman humming, "Rock of Ages," was Alice Murphy, who'd passed in her sleep just 2 months ago. I felt my legs go weak. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been trained to look for logical explanations, kept insisting I was hearing things wrong. Crows were smart birds, everyone knew that. They could mimic sounds, just like parrots. But parrots repeated what they heard. These birds were carrying on conversations with voices of the dead. Mrs. Pemberton grabbed my arm with fingers that felt like bird claws themselves. "You hear them, don't you, Sheriff? You hear them too?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The sound coming from that tree was getting louder, more complex. Children's laughter mixed with old hymns, weather reports from radio announcers who'd been off the air for decades, fragments of phone conversations from people who'd been buried in Millbrook Cemetery for years. That's when I remembered the stories. Every town has its folklore, its whispered tales passed down through generations like family recipes or curses. Millbrook had the Hartwell tree. Old-timers used to say it was planted over a mass grave from the cholera outbreak of 1847, that Moses Hartwell's grandfather had buried 17 souls beneath its roots without proper ceremony or blessing. Said the tree grew strange after that, bore fruit that was always bitter, leaves that fell upward in certain winds. Most folks didn't believe those stories. Hell, I didn't believe them either, until I saw that tree die overnight in 1978. Went to sleep with the healthy oak full of green leaves. Woke up to find it stripped bare, gray as old bones. No disease, no storm, no reason that any botanist could give. Just death, sudden and complete. But the tree kept standing. Year after year, season after season, while other dead trees fell or were cut down, the Hartwell oak remained. And every October 13th, according to the stories, the crows would come. I had never paid attention before. October 13th was just another day in the life of a small-town sheriff. But standing there listening to voices of the dead pouring from the throats of birds, I understood that some stories were more than stories. The voices were getting clearer now, more insistent. I heard my own grandmother calling my name, asking me to bring her pills from the medicine cabinet. She'd been dead for 20 years. I heard Jimmy Kowalski, who drowned in Miller's Pond when we were both 12, asking if I wanted to come swimming. I heard my first deputy, Bill Hawkins, reading the Miranda rights to someone I couldn't see. Mrs. Pemberton's grip tightened on my arm. "They're talking to us, Sheriff. They're trying to tell us something." But I was beginning to think it was worse than that. They weren't trying to tell us something. They were trying to call us something. The voices had a quality I recognized from my years in law enforcement, the same tone people used when they were trying to convince you of something, to lead you somewhere you didn't want to go. I pulled up my radio, keeping my eyes on the tree. "Carson, you there?" The radio crackled with static, then Deputy Carson's voice came through, tinny and distant. "Right here, Sheriff. Everything okay? I need you to look up something for me. Check our records for October 13th, going back as far as you can. Any missing persons, any incidents, anything at all. October 13th, that's today, Sheriff." "I know what day it is, son. Just check the records." While Carson was checking, I studied the tree more carefully. The birds weren't just sitting randomly. They were arranged in a pattern, clusters and groups that almost looked like letters or symbols. And they were all facing the same direction now, not toward me and Mrs. Pemberton, but toward the Hartwell house itself. The house had been empty for 13 years, ever since Moses Hartwell had taken his own life down in the root cellar. Nobody knew why he'd done it. Moses had been a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but he'd seemed content enough. Had a small pension from his years working the railroad, grew vegetables in his backyard, fixed neighbors' radios and television sets for pocket money. But on October 13, 1972, something had driven him down into that cellar with his daddy's old shotgun. The investigating officer, that was Sheriff Morrison, my predecessor, had found Moses sitting in an old wooden chair, facing the corner where the foundation was oldest and deepest. No note, no explanation, just a dead man in a dark cellar, and the smell of cordite and copper pennies. Carson's voice crackled through the radio again. "Sheriff, I found something. October 13th, 1974, we had a missing person report. Mrs. Sarah Daniels, age 67. Never found her. Keep looking. October 13th, 1975, another missing person. Robert Nash, age 43. Disappeared from his home on Elm Street. No trace." My blood went cold. "What address on Elm Street?" 412 Elm Street." That was 3 houses down from where I was standing. 3 houses down from the Hartwell place. "Keep going. Every year, Sheriff. 1976, Margaret Olson. 1977, David Chin. 1978, two people, the Walker twins. All October 13th, all disappeared without a trace. I looked at Mrs. Pemberton. She was staring at the tree with an expression I'd seen on the faces of deer caught in headlights, frozen and waiting for the inevitable impact. Mrs. Pemberton, I said carefully, how long have you lived on this street? 53 years, she whispered. And in all that time, you never noticed the pattern? People disappearing every October 13th? She turned to me then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Course I noticed, Sheriff. We all noticed. But what were we supposed to do? Call the police? Tell them our dead neighbors were calling to us from a tree? The voices from the oak were getting louder, more urgent. I could hear my own name being called now, by people I'd known and people I'd never met, voices young and old, male and female, all of them insistent, all of them beckoning. Sheriff Walker, they called. Come closer, Sheriff. Come see. I took a step backward instead. How many people know about this? Everyone knows, Mrs. Pemberton said. Everyone who's lived here long enough. We just learned to stay inside on October 13th. Close the windows, turn up the television, try not to listen. But people still disappear. Every year. Always someone who's new to town, or someone who doesn't believe the stories, or someone who's just too curious for their own good. As if summoned by her words, I saw movement at the far end of the street. A man was walking toward the tree, moving with the slow, measured steps of someone in a trance. I recognized him as Howard Marsh, who moved to Millbrook just 3 months ago to take over the pharmacy from old Doc Peterson. Mr. Marsh! I called out, but he didn't turn. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the tree, his face blank as fresh paper. The voices from the birds grew excited, welcoming. Howard, they called. Howard, come home. Come back to us. I started running toward him, but it was like moving through thick water. Each step felt heavy, labored, and the voices from the tree seemed to wrap around me like invisible hands, trying to slow me down. Don't fight it, Sheriff, the birds called. Your time will come too. I reached Howard just as he stopped beneath the tree. Up close, I could see his pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow. He was conscious but not present, like a sleepwalker caught in an endless dream. Howard, I said, grabbing his shoulder. Howard, look at me. He turned his head slowly, mechanically. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. They're calling me home, Sheriff. They say it's time. The birds above us rustled their feathers, and the sound was like whispered applause. The voices grew louder still, and now I could hear new ones joining the chorus. Voices I didn't recognize, speaking in languages I couldn't understand, calling out in accents from different eras, different centuries. How long had this been going on? How many people had this tree claimed over the decades, the centuries since it was planted? I tried to pull Howard away, but he resisted with surprising strength. His eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see, something that existed in the space between the gnarled roots of the dead oak. What do you see, Howard? What's down there? The door, he said simply. They're holding the door open for me. I looked where he was looking and saw nothing but dead leaves and dark earth. But the smell, there was something wrong with the smell. It was earthy, yes, but underneath that was something else. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The voices from the tree changed then, becoming more urgent, more demanding. Now, Howard. Come now. Howard took a step forward, toward the base of the tree, and I felt the ground beneath my feet shift slightly, as if something large was moving underneath. The smell grew stronger, and with it came a sound like distant music, like voices singing in harmony from somewhere far below the earth. That's when I understood. The tree wasn't just a gathering place for the crows. It was a doorway. And every October 13th, for reasons I couldn't begin to comprehend, that door opened just wide enough to let one more soul pass through. I drew my service weapon, not because I thought it would help, but because it was the only thing I could think to do. "Howard, we're leaving." "No." But Howard wasn't listening anymore. He was walking toward the tree with the jerky, unnatural gait of a marionette, and the birds above were singing in the voices of everyone Millbrook had ever lost. I fired 2 shots into the air, hoping the noise would break whatever spell held him. The sound echoed down the empty street like thunder, but the birds didn't scatter. They didn't even flinch. They just kept singing, kept calling, kept holding that invisible door open for Howard Marsh. He reached the base of the tree and knelt down, placing his hands flat against the dark earth. The ground beneath him began to sink, creating a depression that hadn't been there moments before. The sweet, rotten smell intensified, and I could swear I heard the sound of soil being moved from somewhere deep underground. "Howard!" But it was too late. The earth opened beneath him like a mouth, and Howard Marsh fell into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. The last thing I saw was his face, peaceful and accepting, as he disappeared into whatever lay beneath the Hartwell tree. The hole closed immediately afterward, leaving nothing but smooth earth and the echo of bird song. The crows fell silent one by one until the only sound was the wind through the dead branches and the hammering of my own heart. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, staring at the spot where Howard had vanished. Then I walked back to Mrs. Pemberton, who was still standing on her porch, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Does it happen every year?" I asked. "Exactly like that." She nodded. "Every year since Moses planted that tree over his grandfather's. Mistake." "What mistake?" "The cholera graves weren't empty when he buried them folks, Sheriff. Some of them were still breathing." I felt sick. 17 people buried alive? 17 souls that never found their rest. And every October 13th, on the anniversary of their burial, they call for company. I looked back at the tree one more time. The crows were dispersing now, flying away in small groups as if their work here was done. By sunset, the oak would be empty again, just another dead tree on a quiet street in a small town where people learn not to ask too many questions. I wrote up Howard Marsh's disappearance as a missing person case, same as my predecessors had done for decades. The state police came, asked their questions, found nothing unusual, and filed their report. Howard's family in Chicago eventually stopped calling for updates. But I never forgot what I saw that day, and I never stopped wondering about that door beneath the tree. In the years that followed, I made it my business to know who was new in town, who might not understand the unspoken rules of October 13th. I'd find excuses to keep them busy that day, send them on errands out of town, anything to keep them away from Elm Street. I saved 4 people that way, maybe 5. But I couldn't save them all. The tree took Mrs. Henderson in 87, young Danny Kowalski in 94, that traveling salesman in 03 whose name I never learned. Each time, the pattern was the same. The crows would gather, the voices would call, and someone would answer. I retired in 2010, passed the badge to Deputy Carson with a warning he didn't fully believe until October 13th of his first year. Now he carries the burden, same as I did, same as Sheriff Morrison did before me. The tree's still there, still dead, still standing. The Hartwell house finally collapsed in on itself about 5 years back, but the oak remains. Every October 13th, the crows come, and the voices of Millbrook's lost souls call out from its branches. They say if you listen carefully, you can hear them planning, discussing who they'll call to join them when the sun sets and the door opens just wide enough for one more. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear Howard Marsh's voice among them, welcoming the next visitor to whatever lies beneath the roots of the Hartwell tree. And every October 13th, I stay inside, close my windows, and try not to listen when they call my name. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Then it smiled. That was 37 years ago, and I still wake up some nights with that grin burned into my eyelids like a camera flash. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 42 years now, seen my share of peculiar things that small towns seem to collect like dust in their corners. But what happened during those 3 weeks in October of '87? Well, that's something I've never talked about. Not officially. Not until now. The first report came in on a Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Henderson from the post office called, voice tight with that particular strain of worry that comes when you're trying to convince yourself you didn't see what you saw. Said she'd been walking her little terrier down by the old railway bridge around dusk when she spotted someone standing underneath it. Pale as milk, she said. Just standing there in the shadows, perfectly still. But Sheriff, she'd whispered into the phone. When I looked back after calling to Pip, it was behind me. Standing right there on the path. Couldn't have been more than 10 feet away. I asked her what she did then. Ran, she said. Ran like the devil himself was breathing down my neck. Now, Mrs. Henderson wasn't the type to spook easily. She'd lived through the Korean War as a young bride, raised 4 sons mostly on her own, while her husband worked the lumber mills up north. If she said she saw something that unsettled her, I took notice. But I figured it was probably just some vagrant who'd found shelter under the bridge. Maybe someone with a few screws loose who thought it was funny to startle an old woman. The railway bridge sat about 2 miles south of town proper, spanning Crow Creek where it carved through a stand of old-growth pine. The tracks hadn't seen a train in 15 years, not since the mill closed and took half the town's jobs with it. The bridge itself was a rusted iron skeleton, maybe 60 feet long, casting shadows even on the brightest days. Local kids used to dare each other to walk across it, but they'd stopped doing that years before. Something about the place had always felt wrong, even to children who couldn't put words to their instincts. I drove out there that evening, parking my patrol car on the gravel road that wound down to the creek. The sun was settling into the treeling, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. October in northern Maine can be beautiful in that sharp, melancholy way that makes you think of endings. The air carried the smell of dying leaves and wood smoke from someone's distant chimney. The bridge loomed overhead as I walked the path beneath it, boots crunching on fallen needles. I called out a few times, asked if anyone was there, but my voice just echoed off the water and died in the trees. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of habitation, no litter or makeshift shelter. Just the steady drip of condensation from the rusted girders and the soft murmur of the creek below. I was turning to leave when I noticed the smell. Faint at first, barely noticeable under the piney autumn scents. But as I stood there, it grew stronger. Sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. The kind of smell that catches in the back of your throat and makes you want to breathe through your mouth. That's when I saw the footprints. They were pressed deep into the muddy bank, barefoot impressions that were too large to belong to Mrs. Henderson or her dog. But what struck me odd was how they were arranged. Instead of a normal walking pattern, they formed a perfect circle right at the water's edge, as if someone had been standing there turning slowly around and around. The mud inside the circle was smooth, undisturbed, but the footprints pressed deep like they'd been made by someone carrying considerable weight. I took photographs, made notes, told myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe someone had been fishing, lost their shoes, got disoriented. People do strange things when they're drunk, or high, or just not thinking straight. But as I walked back to my patrol car, that flower smell seemed to follow me, growing stronger instead of fading. The second report came 3 days later. Tommy Brennan was 17, worked part-time at the hardware store after school. Good kid, never been in any real trouble. He'd been walking home from his girlfriend's house around 9 in the evening, taking the shortcut that led past the railway bridge. According to Tommy, he'd seen someone standing underneath it again, same as Mrs. Henderson described. Pale figure, perfectly still, like a statue carved from moonlight. But Tommy was young and foolish, so instead of running, he'd called out, "Hey! You okay down there?" The figure had turned its head toward him then, and Tommy swore he could see it smiling even from 50 yards away. A wide, impossible grin that seemed to take up half its face. Then, just like with Mrs. Henderson, Tommy had looked away for just a second, glanced down to make sure he wasn't going to trip on the uneven path. And when he looked back up, the thing was standing right beside him. It was close enough to touch, Tommy told me, his hands shaking as he lit his third cigarette in 10 minutes. Close enough that I should have been able to hear it breathing. But there was nothing. No sound at all. Just that smell, like dead flowers. Tommy had run then, same as Mrs. Henderson. But he'd felt something following him all the way home, staying just at the edge of his vision. When he'd finally reached his front door and turned around, the street behind him was empty. But every streetlight between his house and the bridge had gone dark. I drove out to check on those lights the next morning. Every single one had been smashed from the inside, the bulbs scattered in perfect circles around the base of each pole. The city works department said they'd never seen anything like it. Glass doesn't break that way naturally, they told me. Would take considerable force applied from within the housing itself. Word started getting around town, the way word does in small places where everyone knows everyone else's business. People began avoiding the area around the bridge, taking longer routes to get where they were going. The handful of kids who still rode bikes to school started asking their parents for rides instead. Even the local dogs seemed to sense something was wrong. They'd whine and pull their owners in the opposite direction whenever their evening walks led them too close to the creek. But it was old Pete Mackenzie who brought me the detail that made my blood run cold. Pete was pushing 80, half blind from diabetes. But he still insisted on taking his evening constitutional every night at the same time. Had been doing it for 30 years, rain or shine, walking the same route that took him down Creek Road and past the railway bridge. I tried to convince him to change his path, told him about the reports people were making, but Pete was stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. "Sheriff," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with a grunt, "I think I know what your pale person is." Pete had been a mortician before he retired, ran the town's only funeral home for nearly 4 decades. If anyone in Millbrook knew about death and the strange things that sometimes lingered around it, it was Pete. "Saw it 3 nights ago," he continued, his clouded eyes fixed on something beyond my office window. "Standing right where you'd expect, under them rusty girders. But I got close enough to get a proper look before it noticed me." He paused, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small notebook, pages yellowed with age. "Been keeping records," he said, flipping through entries written in his spidery handwriting. "Every person who died in this town in the last 50 years. Dates, causes, where they're buried. You'd be surprised how many folks met their end near that bridge." The list was longer than I'd expected. A dozen names, spanning from 1962 to 1985. Some I remembered, car accidents mostly, a few suicides, one drowning when the creek ran high during spring melt. But Pete had found something else in his research, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Every one of them, he said, tapping the notebook with a gnarled finger, was found with that same smell. Sweet flowers, like a funeral home. And every one of them was discovered with their feet bare, no matter what they'd been wearing when they left home. The temperature in my office seemed to drop 10 degrees. There's something else, Sheriff. That thing under the bridge? It's got the same face as Danny Morrison. Danny Morrison had been 19 when he'd driven his pickup truck off Creek Road during a snowstorm in January of '85. We'd found him 3 days later, thrown clear of the vehicle, lying face up in the snow beneath the railway bridge. The accident report said he died on impact, but Pete remembered something else from the autopsy. Danny's face, even after 3 days in the cold, had been locked in a wide, unnatural grin. Rigor mortis doesn't work that way, Pete said. Never seen anything like it in 40 years of handling the dead. It was like his face had frozen that way while he was still alive, like he'd seen something that made him smile just before. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring out the window toward the dark line of trees that hid the bridge from view. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending dead leaves skittering across my driveway like small, desperate animals. Around 2 in the morning my phone rang. It was Sarah Chin, the night nurse at Millbrook General. Her voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Sheriff, you need to get down here. We've got 3 people in the emergency room, all came in within the last hour. They're all saying the same thing." The 3 patients were strangers to each other, a truck driver passing through town, a teenager who'd been walking home from a late movie, and Mrs. Kowalski, who lived alone on the far side of Creek Road. But they all told the same story. They'd seen something pale standing under the railway bridge. They'd all smelled flowers. They'd all found themselves somewhere else when they blinked, with no memory of how they'd gotten there. But here's what made my hands shake as I took their statements. They'd all been found wandering barefoot along Creek Road, even though they'd all been wearing shoes when they left home. Their shoes were discovered later, arranged in perfect circles under the bridge, like offerings at some unholy shrine. The truck driver had been found 5 miles from where he'd stopped to stretch his legs. The teenager had somehow ended up in his own backyard, though he'd been walking home from downtown. Mrs. Kowalski had been discovered standing in her kitchen, completely unaware of how she'd gotten inside her locked house. All 3 described the same impossible grin, the same feeling of being followed by something that stayed just out of sight. And all 3 had lost nearly 2 hours of time they couldn't account for. Dr. Patterson, who'd been running the emergency room for 15 years, took me aside before I left. "Sheriff, I've seen a lot of strange things in my time, but nothing like this. Their vital signs were all wrong. Heart rates too slow, body temperatures too low, like they'd been exposed to extreme cold for hours. But it's been nearly 60 degrees all week." He handed me copies of their blood work. "And there's something else. They all had the same substance under their fingernails. Organic matter, looks like it might be some kind of plant material. But I sent samples to the state lab, and they can't identify it. Says it doesn't match anything in their database." The plant matter was pale green, almost translucent, with a texture like wet paper. It smelled like those same funeral flowers that everyone kept mentioning. But when I tried to bag a sample for further testing, it dissolved between my fingers like cotton candy, leaving behind only that cloying, sweet scent. 3 more incidents occurred over the next week. Each time, the pattern was the same. People would see the pale figure under the bridge, experience lost time, and be found wandering barefoot with no memory of what had happened to them. The town was starting to panic. People stopped going out after dark. The few remaining businesses along Creek Road boarded up their windows and moved elsewhere. But it was the children who finally made me understand what we were really dealing with. Kids see things differently than adults. Their minds haven't learned yet to dismiss the impossible, to rationalize away the things that don't fit into their understanding of how the world works. So when 8-year-old Lucy Brennan, Tommy's little sister, told me what she'd seen while looking out her bedroom window, I listened. "It's not just one person, Sheriff," she said in that matter-of-fact way children have when they're telling you something they think you should already know. "There's lots of them now. They hold hands and dance in circles under the bridge. And they're all smiling the same smile." From her second-story bedroom window, Lucy had a clear view across the creek to the railway bridge. She'd been having trouble sleeping, she said, because of the singing. "What kind of singing, honey?" "Like a lullaby, but backwards. Makes you want to go down there and join them." Lucy's mother, Janet, had been planning to move the family to her sister's place in Bangor, but she'd been putting it off, hoping things would return to normal. After Lucy's revelation, she packed their bags that same night. "Sheriff," Janet said as she loaded suitcases into her car, "there's something else. Lucy's been walking in her sleep the last 3 nights. Each morning, I find muddy footprints on her bedroom floor, and her pajamas smell like flowers. They left town before dawn, and I never saw them again. That's when I decided I had to end it, whatever it was. I'd been sheriff of this county long enough to know that some problems don't solve themselves. Sometimes you have to face the darkness head-on, even when every instinct you have is screaming at you to run. I spent the day preparing. Loaded my service weapon, though I doubted bullets would be much use against whatever was haunting that bridge. I called my deputy, told him to stay away from Creek Road no matter what he heard on the radio. Then I drove out there as the sun was setting, parking my patrol car on the gravel road just like I had 3 weeks earlier. The bridge looked different in the dying light. The shadows underneath seemed deeper, more substantial, as if darkness itself had taken root there and was growing upward through the iron girders. The smell of flowers was stronger now, almost overwhelming, mixed with something else, something organic and sweet that reminded me of fruit left too long in the sun. I could hear them before I saw them. The singing Lucy had described was real, a wordless melody that seemed to come from the water itself. It was beautiful and wrong at the same time, like a children's lullaby sung by voices that had forgotten how to breathe. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. As I walked down the path toward the bridge, they became visible one by one. Pale figures standing in the shadows, each one wearing that same impossible grin. I recognized some of the faces from old photographs. Danny Morrison was there, along with Margaret Walsh, who'd drowned in the spring of '78, and Jimmy Carver, who'd put his motorcycle into a tree during the summer of '83. But there were others too, faces I didn't recognize but somehow knew belonged to people who'd died near this place long before I'd become sheriff. They stood in a loose circle under the bridge, holding hands like children playing Ring Around the Rosie, their bare feet pressed into the mud of the creek bank. And in the center of their circle sat something that made my blood turn to ice water. It was small, maybe 3 feet tall, pale as bone and smooth as river stone. Its face was a perfect blank except for a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth like broken glass. This was the source of the singing, the thing that had been calling people to the bridge, collecting them like a child collecting fireflies in a jar. I understood then what had been happening. The pale figures weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They were echoes, imprints left behind by people who died with such intense emotion that they'd burned themselves into the very fabric of this place. And something else, something older and hungry, had learned to use those echoes as bait. The thing in the center turned its attention to me, and I felt its pull immediately. My feet wanted to carry me down to the water's edge, to join that endless dance of the dead. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel my consciousness starting to fray at the edges. But I'd come prepared for this moment. From my jacket pocket, I pulled out a road flare and struck it against the rough concrete of the bridge abutment. The sudden red light sent the pale figures reeling backward, their perfect grins twisting into expressions of pain and rage. The singing cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound like wind through a graveyard. The thing in the center of the circle let out a shriek that shattered every piece of glass on my patrol car and sent ripples across the surface of the creek. It began to change, growing larger and more defined, its blank face sprouting eyes like black holes and a nose that was nothing but two ragged slits. I threw the flare into the center of their circle and ran. Behind me, I could hear them following, not just the creature, but all of them, the entire congregation of the dead. Their bare feet slapped against the muddy path like rain on a tin roof, and their collective breathing sounded like wind through winter trees. I made it to my patrol car just as the flare reached the creature. The explosion of light that followed was visible for miles, according to witnesses later. It lit up the entire valley like daylight, casting shadows that stretched all the way to town. The sound that accompanied it wasn't quite thunder and wasn't quite screaming, but something worse than both. When the light faded, the bridge was gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed, simply gone, as if it had never existed. The railway tracks ended abruptly on both sides of the creek, their ends polished smooth as glass. The water ran clear and odorless, without any trace of the sweet flower smell that had haunted the area for weeks. The missing people were found over the next few days, all of them alive but changed. They'd aged years in the space of hours, their hair streaked with premature gray, and their eyes holding a distant, hollow look. None of them remembered anything about their time under the bridge, but they all shared the same recurring nightmare, a pale figure with an impossible grin, reaching out to welcome them home. The official report listed the bridge's disappearance as a structural collapse caused by metal fatigue, the missing people as victims of mass hysteria brought on by toxic mold growing in the area's water supply. The State Environmental Agency found nothing when they tested the creek, but they sealed off the area anyway, citing concerns about contaminated groundwater. I retired the following spring. Told everyone I was getting too old for the job, that it was time for someone younger to take over. The truth was, I couldn't stand being anywhere near that stretch of creek road. Even now, 37 years later, I still take the long way around when I need to go to that part of the county. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I think I can still hear singing coming from the direction of where the bridge used to be. And sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly foolish, I drive out there to look. The creek still runs clear, and the area has grown over with new vegetation that the deer and birds seem to avoid. But if you know where to look, you can still see the outline of where the bridge's shadow used to fall. The grass grows different there, pale and thin, and nothing ever quite takes root. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the mist rises off the water, you can still see footprints pressed into the mud. Bare feet, arranged in perfect circles, as if something is still dancing down there in the shadows. Still waiting for the next person foolish enough to look twice. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Then it smiled. And somewhere out there, in the darkness between what we know and what we fear, I think it's smiling still. I've driven every road in this county. That one wasn't there yesterday. 37 years wearing this badge, and I've memorized every twist of asphalt, every gravel path, every logging trail that branches off into the deep woods surrounding our little town. Hell, I helped survey half of them back when I was young and foolish enough to think I understood the shape of things. But that morning in late October, driving my usual patrol route along the old county highway, I saw it clear as day, a dirt track cutting into the tree line where nothing but bramble and oak had stood the day before. The sun was sitting low and orange through the windshield, throwing long shadows across the cracked pavement. October mornings have their own smell here in the mountains: wood smoke and dying leaves, that crisp bite of winter coming down from the peaks. I'd been breathing that same air for 63 years, and it still caught me sometimes, reminded me why folks stay in places like this even when the sensible thing would be to pack up and find somewhere with better self-service and more than one grocery store. I pulled the cruiser over and sat there idling, studying that new road. It wasn't much to look at, just two tire ruts disappearing into the forest, the kind of track that hunters might make. But hunters ask permission around here. They know which land belongs to who, and more importantly, they know which patches of woods you don't go wandering into after dark. This particular stretch had always been thick and impenetrable, the kind of undergrowth that would tear your clothes and make you bleed just for the privilege of getting lost. The radio crackled with dispatch calling about a fender bender over in Millfield, but I ignored it. Something about that road bothered me, and after 4 decades of police work, you learn to pay attention when your gut starts talking. I climbed out of the car and walked over to where the track began. The transition was too clean. Forest doesn't just part like that, neat as a razor cut. The trees on either side looked old, their trunks thick with age and moss, but the gap between them was precise, geometric. When I knelt down and ran my fingers through the dirt, it came away fine and dry, like dust from an old attic. The tire tracks were clear and recent, but there was something off about them too uniform, too perfect, as if someone had pressed them into the earth with a cookie cutter. I followed the road about 50 yards on foot before the trees closed in overhead, filtering the sunlight into dim green pools. The further I walked, the quieter it became. Not the natural quiet of deep woods, where you can still hear birds and insects and the whisper of wind through leaves. This was a dead quiet, the kind that makes your ears ring and your heart beat a little faster than it should. By the time I turned back, the morning was getting on, and I had real work to do. But I made a note in my patrol log: new logging road, county mile marker 47. Check permits. I figured someone had cut it without filing the proper paperwork. Happens more than you'd think, especially with out-of-state developers who think they can buy a piece of mountain and do whatever they please with it. But when I checked the county records that afternoon, there was nothing. No permits filed, no surveying requests, no applications for road construction. I called the State Forestry Service, thinking maybe they'd put in a fire access road without updating our local files. The woman who answered laughed when I described the location. "Sheriff, that's all private land out there. The Hendricks property. Been in the family for over a century, and old man Hendricks would sooner shoot you than let you cut a trail across his woods." "You sure you got the location right?" I was sure. I'd grown up knowing the Hendricks place, a sprawling tract of old-growth forest that the family had kept untouched since the 1800s. They were peculiar people, the Hendricks clan, kept to themselves, rarely came to town except for supplies. The old man had died 3 years back, and his grandson had inherited the land along with all the family eccentricities. I'd had to serve him papers once regarding a property dispute, drove all the way up to the old homestead on the mountain's shoulder. The boy, though he was past 40 now, had watched me from his porch with pale eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of something nocturnal. I decided to drive out there again that evening, just to make sure I hadn't been seeing things. Sometimes the mind plays tricks, especially when you're getting older and the job starts wearing on you heavier than it used to. But as I took the turn onto the county highway, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. The road was still there. Only now it looked different. Older somehow, more settled. The ruts had deepened, and tall grass was growing up between them, as if they'd been there for years instead of hours. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches forming a tunnel of shadows that stretched further into the woods than I remembered. I parked the cruiser and grabbed my flashlight, though there was still enough daylight to see clearly. The October air had turned colder with the setting sun, and I could smell something else now underneath the usual forest scents, something stale and musty, like old paper or fabric that had been stored too long in a damp place. This time I walked deeper into the woods, following the mysterious road as it curved and dipped through the trees. Every 100 yards or so, I'd stop and listen, but the silence remained absolute. No owls, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Just the sound of my own breathing and the soft crunch of dirt under my boots. After about a quarter mile, the road opened into a small clearing. In the center stood a single structure, a wooden sign, weathered and gray with age. I approached it slowly, playing my flashlight beam across the faded letters carved deep into the wood. Belmont Road EST 1923. The name meant nothing to me, and I thought I knew every road name in the county. But what made my skin crawl was the date. 1923. If this road had been here for nearly a century, why hadn't I ever seen it before? Why wasn't it on any map? I took a photo with my phone, though the flash seemed to get swallowed by the surrounding darkness. When I looked at the screen, the image was blurry and distorted, as if something had been moving in front of the lens. I tried several more shots, but they all came out the same way, unclear, shadowy, wrong. That's when I heard it. A sound like engines in the distance, growing closer. Not the rumble of modern cars, but something older, rougher. The puttering growl of vehicles from another era. I killed my flashlight and stepped behind the nearest tree, watching the road ahead. Headlights appeared through the branches, but they were wrong too small, too yellow, casting weak circles of light that barely penetrated the gloom. As they came closer, I could make out the shapes of automobiles, but they looked like something from an old movie. Boxy sedans with running boards and tall, narrow windows. Chrome bumpers that caught the failing light and threw it back in strange patterns. The cars moved slowly, almost ceremonially, as if they were part of some kind of procession. I counted 5 of them before they passed my hiding place and continued deeper into the woods. Through the windows, I caught glimpses of passengers, pale faces turned straight ahead, hands folded in their laps, expressions blank and distant. They wore clothes that looked decades out of date, men in dark suits and fedoras, women in simple dresses with their hair pinned back in styles I hadn't seen since looking through my grandmother's photo albums. The last car in the procession was different from the others. Longer, more elaborate, with a rounded roof and small windows darkened with curtains. A hearse. And as it passed, I could swear I heard music playing inside, something slow and mournful, though I couldn't make out the melody. I waited until the sound of engines faded completely before I moved. My hands were shaking as I turned the flashlight back on, and I had to try twice before I could get it switched on. The beam wavered as I stepped back onto the road, illuminating the twin ruts that the cars had followed. But there were no tire tracks in the dust. No evidence that anything had passed this way at all. I made it back to my cruiser in record time, not quite running but moving fast enough to work up a sweat despite the cold air. As I fumbled with my keys, I kept glancing back toward the woods, half expecting to see those pale headlights returning. But the forest remained dark and silent. At home that night, I pulled out every map I owned, spreading them across my kitchen table. County maps, state maps, topographical surveys, even some hand-drawn charts from the local historical society. I traced every road, every trail, every pathway that ran through our section of the mountains. There was no Belmont Road. There never had been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something obvious. The name nagged at me, floating just at the edge of memory like a word you can't quite recall. It wasn't until I was lying in bed, listening to the house settle around me, that it came to me. Belmont. I'd seen that name before, carved into weathered stone in the old section of Oakwood Cemetery. It was a family plot, a cluster of headstones dating back to the early 1900s. I noticed it years ago during a Memorial Day cleanup, mostly because all the dates of death were clustered around the same time period. 1923, 1924, 1925. Some kind of epidemic, I'd figured, or maybe a bad winter that took the old and weak. The next morning, I drove straight to the cemetery. Oakwood sits on a hill overlooking the town, its iron gates perpetually open though few people visit anymore. The newer sections are well maintained, with neat rows of granite markers and carefully tended flower beds. But the old section, where the town's founding families rest, has grown wild over the years. Weeds push up between the headstones, and some of the older graves have begun to sink into the soft earth. I found the Belmont plot without much trouble. 7 graves in total, arranged in a rough circle around a central monument, a tall obelisk carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The individual headstones told a story of gradual loss, first the elderly patriarch in 1923, then his wife a few months later, followed by their adult children and grandchildren in steady succession. The last to die was a young woman named Sarah Belmont, aged 22, in October of 1925. But it was the inscription on her headstone that made my blood run cold. She waits where the road ends. I spent the rest of that day in the library, digging through old newspapers and town records. What I found didn't make me feel any better. The Belmont family had owned a large tract of land on the outskirts of town, including the section where I'd seen the mysterious road. They'd been prosperous folks, owned a sawmill and employed half the town at one time or another. But in 1923, something had gone wrong. The newspaper accounts were vague, the way small-town journalism tends to be when dealing with unpleasant subjects. There had been some kind of accident at the mill, followed by a series of unexplained deaths. The family began dying off one by one, always in the same way, found in their beds, peaceful as if they'd simply gone to sleep, but with expressions of such profound terror that those who found them never forgot the sight. By 1925, the Belmont name had disappeared from the town records entirely. The sawmill closed, the big house on the hill was abandoned, and the land passed to distant relatives who sold it off piece by piece. Most of it eventually ended up in the hands of the Hendricks family, who seemed to have an unusual interest in keeping certain sections of the forest undisturbed. That evening, I found myself driving out to the county highway again. I told myself I was just checking, making sure the road hadn't reappeared. But deep down, I knew I was hoping it would be there. Something about the mystery had gotten its hooks into me, the way unsolved cases always do. The road was there, just as I'd expected. But this time, there was a car parked at its entrance, an old sedan that looked like it belonged in the same era as the vehicles I'd seen the night before. The driver's door stood open, and I could see someone sitting behind the wheel. I approached cautiously, my hand resting on the grip of my service pistol. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The driver was a woman, young, wearing a simple white dress that seemed to glow in the fading light. Her hair was dark and long, pinned back in an old-fashioned style. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead down the mysterious road. "Ma'am?" I called out, but she didn't respond. I moved closer, close enough to see her face in profile. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. There was something familiar about her features, something that reminded me of the headstone. Sarah Belmont. The photograph carved into the granite had been worn by weather and time, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Same delicate bone structure, same dark hair, same distant expression. I took another step forward, and she turned to look at me. Her eyes were the color of deep water, and when she smiled, I felt something cold crawl up my spine. "You're early," she said, her voice soft and musical but somehow wrong, like an echo of an echo. "They don't usually come until after midnight." "Who doesn't come?" I managed to ask, though my mouth had gone dry as dust. She gestured toward the road with one pale hand. "The ones who remember. The ones who know the way." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "Don't you remember, Sheriff? You've been here before." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I'd never seen her before in my life. But as she spoke, images began to flash through my mind, dim memories or maybe dreams I'd forgotten. Walking down this same road in the darkness, following those strange yellow headlights deeper into the woods. Standing in a clearing where voices whispered from empty air, where the ground felt soft and yielding beneath my feet like freshly turned earth. "I don't understand," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, part of me did understand. Part of me remembered. "The road only appears for those who belong here," she explained, her smile never wavering. "Those who are ready to make the journey. It's been waiting for you, Sheriff. We've all been waiting." I looked down at myself and felt a shock of recognition. I was no longer wearing my uniform. Instead, I wore a dark suit that felt familiar but old-fashioned, with a vest and a pocket watch that I couldn't remember owning. My patrol car was gone, replaced by an automobile that looked like something from the 1920s. "This isn't real," I whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to me. Sarah Belmont laughed, and the sound was like silver bells ringing in a distant church. "Reality is what we make it, Sheriff. And this is where we make it now. This is where we've always made it." She climbed out of her car and walked toward me, her white dress seeming to float rather than move with her steps. As she approached, I could see through her slightly, as if she were made of morning mist. But her hand, when she took mine, felt solid and cold as winter stone. "Come," she said, leading me toward the road. "They're waiting for you. They've been waiting for a very long time." We walked together down the dusty track, past the weathered sign, deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone before. The trees grew closer together here, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so thick that no sunlight could penetrate. But somehow I could see clearly, as if the darkness itself provided its own illumination. Other figures began to appear along the roadside, men and women in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and distant but somehow familiar. I recognized some of them from the cemetery, names I'd read on weathered headstones during my years of patrol. They nodded as we passed, their eyes following our progress with expressions of patient expectation. The road curved and dipped, leading us past landmarks that shouldn't have existed, a covered bridge spanning a creek that had dried up decades ago, a one-room schoolhouse with broken windows and a bell tower that leaned at an impossible angle, a crossroads where a gallows stood with a rope that swayed gently in the still air. Finally, we reached our destination, a clearing much larger than the one where I'd seen the sign. In the center stood a huge oak tree, its trunk so wide that it would take a dozen men holding hands to encircle it. The tree was dead, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like the arms of a supplicant, but somehow it radiated a presence that felt ancient and aware. Gathered beneath the tree were more people, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All dressed in the fashions of bygone eras, all standing in perfect silence, all waiting. As Sarah led me toward them, they parted to create a path leading directly to the tree's massive trunk. "This is where it ends," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where we all come eventually. The road always leads here, Sheriff. It just takes some of us longer to find our way." I looked up at the dead oak, at its gnarled branches silhouetted against the sky that held no stars. Something was carved into its bark, symbols and words and languages I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They told a story of loss and waiting, of souls caught between worlds, of a place where time folded in on itself like a paper crane. "I'm not dead," I said, but the words felt strange in my mouth. Sarah's smile was infinitely sad. "Neither are we, Sheriff. Not exactly. We're just somewhere else. Somewhere between what was and what will be. The road brought you here because you belong here. Because part of you has always been here." As she spoke, memories began to flood back, not from my life as sheriff, but from something deeper, older. I remembered this place from childhood dreams, from stories my grandmother told on winter nights, from warnings whispered by old-timers who claimed certain parts of the woods were best left alone. I remembered walking this road before, long before I ever wore a badge, following the pale lights deeper into the forest where reality grew thin and malleable. The assembled crowd began to move, forming a circle around the great tree. They joined hands, and Sarah took mine, her touch cold but strangely comforting. As we stood there in the shadow of the dead oak, I felt something shift inside me, a loosening, a letting go, as if invisible chains were falling away. "It's time," Sarah whispered, and the others began to sing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, rising and falling like the wind through autumn leaves. I didn't know the words, but somehow my voice joined theirs, adding to the harmony that seemed to resonate not just in the air but in the very ground beneath our feet. The dead tree began to sway, its branches rustling though there was no wind, and I could feel something stirring in its roots, in the dark earth where secrets lay buried. The song reached a crescendo, and suddenly the clearing was filled with light, not the harsh glare of electric bulbs, but something softer, warmer, like candlelight or fireflies or the first rays of dawn breaking through a long night. In that light I saw the truth of what we were, what we had always been. Souls caught between worlds, tethered to this place by bonds older than memory, older than time itself. And in that moment of revelation, I understood why the road only appeared at night, why it seemed to shift and change, why it led only those who were ready to make the final journey. It wasn't really a road at all. It was an invitation, a calling, a way home for those who had been wandering too long in the spaces between life and death. The light faded gradually, and I found myself standing alone in the clearing. The others were gone, Sarah, the assembled crowd, even the great dead oak. In its place stood a simple wooden cross, weathered and gray with age. At its base, a single headstone bore a name I recognized, my own. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were translucent now, fading like morning mist. The dark suit was gone, replaced by my familiar sheriff's uniform, but it too was beginning to fade. I understood then that my time was ending, that the road had finally led me where I needed to go. But there was one last thing I needed to do. The next morning, they found Sheriff's cruiser parked beside the county highway, empty except for a handwritten note left on the dashboard. The note described everything I've just told you: the mysterious road, the pale figures, the clearing where time stood still. The note ended with a warning: stay away from the woods after dark, especially on nights when the moon is dark and the air smells of old paper and forgotten dreams. They searched for me for weeks, but never found so much as a footprint in the forest. The road I described was nowhere to be found, though some of the search party reported feeling watched as they combed through the trees. One volunteer, a young deputy fresh out of the academy, claimed he saw lights moving through the woods one night, pale yellow circles that seemed to beckon him deeper into the darkness. But when the sun rose, there was nothing there but brambles and oak trees, just as there had always been. They declared me missing, presumed dead. My house was sold, my belongings distributed to distant relatives who barely remembered my name. The town moved on, as small towns do, filing my disappearance away with all the other minor mysteries that accumulate over the decades. But sometimes, on certain October nights when the air grows cold and the shadows stretch long across the county highway, drivers report seeing something that shouldn't be there. A dirt road cutting into the treeline where nothing but forest should stand. Most people drive past without stopping, dismissing it as a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the setting sun. But a few, those who carry the right kind of darkness in their hearts, those who understand that some mysteries are invitations rather than warnings, these few will pull over and walk into the woods. They follow the dusty track as it winds deeper into the forest, past weathered signs and impossible landmarks, until they reach the clearing where I wait with Sarah and all the others who found their way home. The road is patient. It appears when it's needed, for those who are ready to make the journey. And it's always been here, really, you just have to know how to look for it. Some nights, when the moon is dark and the county highway stretches empty and quiet toward the mountains, it's there waiting. All you have to do is follow it to the end. Just remember, once you start walking down that road, there's only one destination. And once you arrive, you never leave. But then again, by the time you get there, you won't want to. There's no house. There's never been a house. But someone leaves mail. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years, and in all that time, I've seen things that would make most folks pack up and head for the city. But this one still keeps me up at night, and it happened near on 15 years ago now. Makes me wonder if some stories are better left untold. But maybe speaking it aloud will finally let me sleep proper again. The mailbox sits about 2 miles west of town, just past where Elm Creek makes that sharp bend toward the old Hendricks property. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd drive right past, just another piece of rural decay in a county full of forgotten corners. But once you've seen it, really seen it, it stays with you like a splinter under the skin. It's an old Craftsman model, probably from the 50s, painted red once upon a time but now more rust than metal. The kind you see leaning against barns and tucked into overgrown yards all across farm country. Nothing special about it, except for two things: the flag's always up, and it's sitting in the middle of a clearing where no house has ever stood. I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning in late September. The leaves hadn't started turning yet, but there was that crisp edge to the air that promised winter was coming whether we were ready or not. I was driving back from the Hendricks place. Old Martha had called about prowlers again, though what she'd seen turned out to be nothing more than deer, when something caught my eye. The mailbox stood there like a sentinel, maybe 20 yards off the road, surrounded by nothing but browning grass and a few scraggly sumacs. The red flag stood at attention against the gray morning sky, and for reasons I still can't explain, I felt compelled to stop. The clearing was perfectly round, about 40 feet across, as if someone had taken a giant cookie cutter to the landscape. The grass grew thin and pale, not like the thick green carpet you'd expect in a county where everything grows wild given half a chance. At the center sat the mailbox, mounted on a weathered wooden post that had seen better decades. I approached it with the cautious curiosity that comes natural to my line of work. The metal was cold under my fingers, colder than the morning air warranted. I lifted the little door, and inside was a single envelope, cream-colored and expensive-looking, addressed in careful cursive to simply, "Resident." No house number. No street name. Just, "Resident," and nothing more. I looked around the clearing again, searching for any sign that a structure had once stood there. Foundation stones, a chimney, even the slight depression in the earth that marks where buildings used to be. But there was nothing. The ground was level and undisturbed, as if it had been empty since the glaciers retreated. The logical part of my brain, the part that writes reports and testifies in court, told me someone was playing a prank. Kids from town, maybe, or someone with too much time and too little sense. I pocketed the letter and made a mental note to check the property records when I got back to the office. But as I walked back to my cruiser, I could feel the mailbox watching me. I know how that sounds, but 37 years of police work teaches you to trust your instincts, even when they don't make sense. I glanced back once before I reached the road, and could have sworn the flag had moved, just slightly, like it was waving goodbye. Back at the station, I pulled up the county records on my computer. The clearing sat on a piece of land that had changed hands more times than seemed reasonable for such a small plot. First recorded owner was a man named Jeremiah Thorne, who'd purchased it in 1923. He'd sold it 2 years later to the county, which had immediately sold it to a family called the Washingtons. They'd owned it for less than a year before selling it back to the county again. The pattern repeated itself through the decades. Families would buy the land, hold it for a year or two at most, then sell it back to the county at a loss. Nobody ever built anything on it. Nobody ever filed permits or drew up building plans. They'd just buy it and then, seemingly, change their minds. The most recent owner was listed as Helen Moser, who'd purchased the plot 3 months ago. I knew Helen. She ran the flower shop on Main Street and had lived in Millbrook her whole life. Nice lady, sensible. Not the type to buy random patches of empty land for no reason. I drove to her shop that afternoon. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful welcome as I stepped inside, and Helen looked up from arranging a display of fall mums with a smile that faltered when she saw my expression. "Sheriff? Is everything all right? I'm hoping you can help me with something, Helen. That plot of land you bought out on Elm Creek Road, the one with the clearing?" Her face went pale, and she set down the flowers with hands that shook just slightly. "I don't know what you mean. County records show you as the current owner." She was quiet for a long moment, fussing with the mums without really seeing them. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I dream about it sometimes. Have for years. In the dream, there's a house there, white clapboard with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. There's a garden, too, with roses and lavender and all the flowers I've ever loved. In the dream, it's mine, and I'm happy there." She looked up at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for comfort. "So when the land came available, I bought it. Thought maybe I could make the dream real, you know? Build the house I kept seeing. But when I went out there," she shuddered, "it felt wrong. Like the ground itself was sick. I couldn't even stay long enough to pace off where the house would go." "What about the mailbox?" "What mailbox?" The way she said it, with genuine confusion, sent a chill down my spine. "There's a mailbox in the center of the clearing, Helen. Old red one with the flag up." She stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. "Sheriff, I've been out there a dozen times since I bought the land. There's nothing there but grass and weeds." That night, I drove back to the clearing with a heavy-duty flashlight and a growing sense of unease. The mailbox stood exactly where I'd left it, flag still raised against the star-filled sky. I walked around it in a wide circle, playing the beam of light across every inch of the surrounding area. There were no footprints in the soft earth except my own from that morning. No tire tracks leading to the clearing. No sign that anyone had been there in years. But the mailbox sat there, real as the badge on my chest, and when I opened it, there was another letter inside. This one was addressed to the sheriff. My name wasn't on it anywhere, just those 2 words in the same careful cursive. I opened it with fingers that weren't quite steady, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "Thank you for checking on us. We appreciate your diligence. Please don't stop coming. I read it 3 times by flashlight before folding it carefully and putting it in my pocket next to the first letter. The logical part of my brain was working overtime, trying to construct explanations that made sense. Someone was watching me, had to be. Someone with a twisted sense of humor and too much time on their hands. But the rest of me, the part that had learned to listen to the whispers that lived in the spaces between logic and reality, knew I was dealing with something else entirely. I started checking the mailbox every few days after that. Told myself it was part of my regular patrol route, just keeping an eye on things. But the truth was, I couldn't stay away. Each time, there was a new letter waiting, always addressed to either resident or the sheriff. The messages were simple, domestic. The weather has been lovely. Thank you for asking. Please water the garden while we're away. The cat got out again. If you see her, please bring her home. Never any signature. Never any return address. Just those polite, mundane messages that suggested a life being lived in a place where no life existed. I started keeping a log, documenting each visit and what I found. Call it professional habit or call it the need to maintain some grip on reality. Either way, I needed the routine of writing it all down. The letters came regularly, every few days, as if someone was maintaining a normal correspondence with the world. Helen Moser sold the land back to the county after 6 weeks. She never said why, and I never asked. Some questions are better left unspoken in a place like Millbrook County, where the spaces between houses hold too many secrets, and the old families know things they don't talk about in daylight. The new owner was a developer from the city, some hotshot who'd bought up half the county planning to build vacation homes for folks wanting to escape urban life. He lasted 2 months before selling it back at a significant loss. After him came a retired couple from Minneapolis, then a young family looking for cheap land to build their dream home. They all followed the same pattern: buy the land with big plans, visit once or twice, then sell it back as quickly as possible. When I asked them about it, casual-like, as if I was just making conversation, they'd get that same look Helen had worn. Confused and unsettled, like they were trying to remember a dream that had turned into a nightmare. None of them mentioned seeing the mailbox. I began to understand that whatever was happening in that clearing, I was the only one who could see it. The realization should have been comforting. Maybe I was just losing my mind, which was at least an explanation that made sense. But it wasn't comforting at all. It was terrifying in a way that made my bones ache and my sleep restless. The letters kept coming, and they started getting more personal. Thank you for visiting so regularly. It gets lonely out here. We saw you talking to Helen at the flower shop. She has good taste in roses. Your wife makes beautiful quilts. The blue one in your front window is especially lovely. That last one made my blood run cold. Martha had just finished that quilt the week before, and it was indeed hanging in our front window. But our house was 5 miles from the clearing, and there was no way anyone standing by that mailbox could see it. No way anyone could see anything but empty fields and distant tree lines. I started varying my routine, visiting at different times of day and taking different routes. But it didn't matter. Whoever was leaving the letters always seemed to know exactly when I'd been there and what I'd been doing. They knew about the church potluck Martha organized, about my grandson's baseball games, about the new deputy I'd hired from the next county over. They knew things about Millbrook that even I didn't know, despite having lived here all my life. The original church bell is buried behind the cemetery. It cracked during the fire of 1887. There are 17 houses in town that have never sold to anyone outside the founding families. The Hendricks property sits on the old Shawnee burial ground, but the county records were altered to hide this fact. I looked into these claims, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly out of a desperate need to prove my mysterious correspondent wrong. But every single detail checked out. The church records mentioned a bell that had been damaged in a fire and quietly replaced. The property deeds, when I dug deep enough, showed that certain houses had indeed never left the control of Millbrook's oldest families. And in the basement of the county courthouse, in a file that shouldn't have existed, I found the original survey maps that clearly marked sacred ground where the Hendricks farm now stood. Whoever was leaving these letters knew the secret history of Millbrook County better than anyone had a right to know. They knew things that had been deliberately forgotten, buried under decades of careful silence and willful ignorance. The worst part was that I started looking forward to the letters. They broke the monotony of small-town police work, and I found myself genuinely curious about what revelation would be waiting for me next. It felt like having a conversation with the town itself, as if the collective memory of Millbrook had somehow taken physical form and chosen me as its confidant. But conversations, I was learning, go both ways. One morning in late October, I found a letter that was different from the others. Instead of the usual cream-colored envelope, this one was made of rough, yellowed paper that looked handmade. The message inside was longer than usual. "You've been very patient with us, Sheriff, and we appreciate that more than you know. Most people would have stopped coming by now, but you keep checking, keep caring. That means something in a place where caring has become rare. We have a gift for you, a token of our appreciation. Look under the posts." I knelt beside the mailbox and brushed away the thin layer of soil at the base of the wooden post. My fingers found something hard and smooth, and I carefully worked it free from the earth. It was a badge, tarnished with age but still clearly readable. "Sheriff, Millbrook County." The style was old, from the 1940s or 50s, with an ornate border and slightly different typography than the badges we use now. I turned it over and found an inscription on the back. J. Whitmore, 1947 to 1952. I knew that name. Jeremiah Whitmore had been sheriff of Millbrook County right after the war, had died in office from a heart attack. His widow had donated his badge to the County Historical Society, where it had been displayed in a glass case for decades until the society folded and their artifacts were scattered to collectors and distant relatives. But here it was, buried under a mailbox that stood in a clearing where no building had ever existed, left as a gift by someone who couldn't possibly have known I'd find it meaningful. I took the badge home and spent the evening researching Sheriff Whitmore. He'd been well regarded, from what I could find in the old newspaper archives. Honest, dedicated, the kind of lawman small towns depended on. He'd handled the usual small-town crimes, domestic disputes, petty theft, the occasional drunk and disorderly, but there was one case that stood out. In the spring of 1952, just a few months before his death, Whitmore had investigated reports of trespassing on what the newspaper described as vacant county land west of town. According to the brief article, several residents had complained about unauthorized mail delivery to a non-existent address. The investigation had been closed without resolution when Sheriff Whitmore suffered his fatal heart attack. The location described in the article matched the clearing exactly. I sat in my study that night, holding Whitmore's badge and staring at copies of 70-year-old newspaper clippings, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had Jeremiah Whitmore stood in that same clearing, opened that same mailbox, read letters from the same mysterious correspondent? Had he felt the same creeping certainty that he was communicating with something that existed outside the normal boundaries of reality? The next morning, I returned to the clearing with questions I wasn't sure I was ready to have answered. The mailbox sat waiting, flag raised like a greeting, and inside was an envelope addressed simply to Sheriff Whitmore's successor. You found the badge. We hoped you would. Jeremiah was a good man, like you. He understood that some mysteries are meant to be guardians rather than puzzles to be solved. The people of Millbrook need protecting, even from truths they're not ready to accept. Especially from those truths. We've been here since the beginning, Sheriff. Since before the first houses were built and the first roads were laid. We remember when this was all forest and stream, when the only visitors were hunting parties and traveling tribes who knew enough to ask permission before they passed through. The town grew around us, but we remained. We watch. We remember. We keep the deeper secrets safe so that the people can sleep soundly in their beds and worry about ordinary things like mortgages and school board elections. But watching is lonely work, and remembering is a burden. Your visits have become the bright spots in our existence. The fact that you keep coming, keep caring, despite your fear and confusion, tells us that Millbrook is still in good hands. Thank you, Sheriff, for everything. I read the letter 3 times, there in the cold morning air, while the mailbox stood silent and patient beside me. For the first time since this all began, I had the sense that I was reaching the end of something rather than the beginning. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket with all the others I'd collected over the months. Then I reached into the mailbox one more time, checking to see if there was anything else waiting for me. My fingers found one final envelope, smaller than the others, made of the same rough paper as the badge had been wrapped in. Inside was a single sentence in that familiar careful cursive. "Will you keep our secret?" I stood there in the clearing for a long time, thinking about Jeremiah Whitmore and all the sheriffs who might have come before him. Thinking about the weight of secrets, and the loneliness of guardianship. Thinking about the difference between protecting people from danger and protecting them from truth. Finally, I took out my pen and wrote my answer on the back of the paper. Yes. I put it back in the mailbox and lowered the flag for the first time since I'd been visiting the clearing. Then I walked back to my cruiser and drove into town to start another day of ordinary police work in a place that was anything but ordinary. That was 3 months ago. I still drive past the clearing on my regular patrol route, but the mailbox is gone now. The clearing remains, that perfect circle of thin grass surrounded by sumac and scrub oak, but there's no sign that a mailbox ever stood there. No post hole, no disturbance in the earth, nothing. Helen Moser has started having different dreams. She tells me they're about a bookstore now, cozy and warm, with a cat sleeping in the window and the smell of coffee always brewing in the back room. She's thinking about opening one downtown, in the empty storefront next to the pharmacy. The Hendricks property hasn't had any more prowler reports. Martha's quilts have been selling better than ever at the church craft fairs. My new deputy is settling in well, and the town seems more peaceful than it has in years. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I take out Jeremiah Whitmore's badge and hold it in my hands. I think about the letters I never showed to anyone, the secrets I carry now like stones in my pocket. I think about the watchers who remember what we've forgotten, and the guardians who keep us safe from truths we're not ready to face. And I understand now why Sheriff Whitmore's heart gave out when it did. Not from the stress of normal police work, but from the weight of knowing that some mysteries are bigger than the people they touch. Some secrets are too important to solve, and some stories are too dangerous to tell completely. But I'm telling this one anyway, because I'm getting old and the burden is getting heavy. Because maybe somewhere out there is another sheriff in another small town who's found something they can't explain, and needs to know they're not alone. Just remember what I learned in that clearing west of town. Not every mystery needs solving, and not every truth needs telling. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is keep quiet and let people sleep soundly in their beds, dreaming of bookstores and flower gardens and all the normal, beautiful things that make life worth living. Even if you know there are other things watching over them in the dark. Even if you know those things have been there all along, patient and protective and utterly beyond human understanding. Even if you know they're still there, will always be there, keeping their vigil in the spaces between what is and what might be. The flag is down now, but the mail still gets delivered. Just not to us. The last time that dog showed up, 5 people didn't make it through the night. I'd been sheriff of Millbrook for 37 years come August, and in all that time, I've seen enough to make a man question what he knows about the world. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has haunted me quite like that black dog. Some folks in town call it the harbinger. Others just cross themselves and look away when its name comes up. Me? I call it the reason I keep a flask in my desk drawer and haven't slept a full night in 15 years. Millbrook sits in a valley between 2 ridges of pine and granite, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody else's business 3 generations back. Population holds steady around 800 souls, give or take whoever's moved away to the city or whoever's moved back home when the world got too big for them. We got 1 main street, 2 churches, a diner that's been serving the same meatloaf since Eisenhower was president, and secrets that run deeper than the abandoned mine shafts honeycomb the hills around us. The dog first showed up in my records back in 1987. Course, old-timers tell stories stretching back to their grandfather's time, but 1987 is when I started keeping track proper. That was the year the Hendricks family died in their sleep, all 4 of them, from carbon monoxide poisoning. Faulty furnace, the state investigators said. Nothing suspicious about it. Except for Mrs. Kowalski, who lived across the street and swore she'd seen a dog big as a calf sitting on their front porch 3 days running before it happened. Black as midnight, she said, with eyes that reflected streetlight like coins at the bottom of a well. I didn't pay much attention to her story then. Mrs. Kowalski was 83 and had been known to see all manner of things that weren't there. But I started paying attention real quick when the same story surfaced 6 months later, after Tommy Brennan wrapped his Camaro around the old oak at Miller's Bend. His girlfriend survived, barely, and between the morphine and the shock, she kept talking about a dog that had been following their car for miles before the accident. Big black dog, she said, keeping pace at 60 miles an hour like it was nothing more than a Sunday stroll. That's when I started the file. Simple manila folder, nothing official, just my own notes and observations. Black dog sightings, written on the tab in my careful handwriting. Over the years, that folder got thick as a phone book. The thing about the dog is that it's not always the same people who see it. Sometimes it's children, wide-eyed and insistent that there's a dog in their yard that won't come when called. Sometimes it's adults, usually the practical ones who don't believe in anything they can't touch. And sometimes, this is the part that makes my skin crawl, sometimes nobody sees it at all. But the photographs tell a different story. Take the Morrison wedding in '92. Beautiful October afternoon, leaves just starting to turn, the whole town gathered at the Methodist church. Professional photographer from the county seat taking pictures, the kind of fellow who'd been documenting weddings and graduations for 20 years. When the film came back, there it was in the background of the reception shots. A black shape sitting perfectly still among the gravestones in the cemetery behind the church. Dog-shaped, but too big, too dark, like someone had cut a hole in the photograph itself. 3 days later, the bride's father had a massive heart attack while mowing his lawn. 47 years old, healthy as a horse up until that moment, when his heart just stopped like someone had thrown a switch. The photographer swore he'd never seen any dog during the reception. Said he would have noticed something that size, that dark. But there it was in the pictures, clear as day and twice as unnatural. That's the pattern, you see. The dog appears, and within a week, usually within 3 days, someone dies. Not always someone who saw it, mind you. Sometimes it's their neighbor, their cousin, their best friend from childhood. The dog doesn't seem to care about the direct connection. It's more like it's marking the spot, claiming territory before death comes to collect. I've tried catching it. Lord knows I've tried. Set up cameras, enlisted the help of every volunteer I could muster, even brought in a tracking dog from the state police once. That was a mistake I won't make again. Rex was a German shepherd, 10 years old, trained in narcotics detection and man tracking. Calm, steady dog who never shown fear of anything in his working life. But when we brought him to the Elmwood Cemetery where the dog had been spotted 3 nights running, Rex took one sniff of the air and went absolutely rigid. Hair standing up from nose to tail, a low whine building in his throat like a tea kettle about to blow. Then he bolted, broke his lead and ran straight back to the patrol car, where he spent the next hour shaking like he had palsy. The handler said he'd never seen anything like it. Said Rex acted like he'd caught scent of something that shouldn't exist. Maybe he had. The cemetery is where I've seen it most often, though it's been spotted all over town. Something about those old graves seems to draw it. We got headstones dating back to 1824, when the first settlers carved their names into the valley. Lots of children buried there. Childhood was dangerous business in those days. Lots of women who died in childbirth, men who died in the mines or the mills. The kind of death that comes sudden and hard, without warning or preparation. I started noticing that the dog showed up most often near the older graves, the ones where the names have been worn smooth by weather and time. Sometimes I'd find myself walking those rows of weathered marble and granite, reading what names I could still make out, wondering if the dog was drawn to specific graves or if it just preferred the company of the long dead. It was during one of those walks that I met Ezra Thorne. Ezra was about my age, maybe a few years older, with the kind of lined face that comes from spending 70 years squinting into the sun. He'd moved to Millbrook from somewhere back east, bought the old garrison place on the hill overlooking the town. Kept to himself mostly, but I'd see him at the grocery store or the diner, always polite, always ready with a nod and a quiet word about the weather. I found him sitting on a stone bench in the cemetery on a Tuesday afternoon in March, feeding breadcrumbs to a crow that perched on his knee like they were old friends. The crow looked at me with one bright black eye, cawed once, and flew away when I approached. "Sheriff," Ezra said, not looking up from the grave he'd been contemplating. "I've been wondering when you'd show up." The headstone was old, 1800s. The name worn away to nothing but a few curved lines that might have been letters once upon a time. I asked him if he'd known whoever was buried there. "Not exactly," he said, "but I know what they died of." He stood up, brushing crumbs from his lap, and looked at me with pale blue eyes that seemed older than his face. "You've been tracking it, haven't you? The black dog. Writing down dates, times, places. Trying to find a pattern." I didn't bother asking how he knew. Small towns don't keep secrets long, and a sheriff asking questions about mysterious dog sightings was bound to get around eventually. 26 years I've been keeping records," I told him. 43 confirmed sightings, 38 deaths that followed within a week. "You know something about it?" Ezra smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I know it's been here a lot longer than 26 years, Sheriff. I know it was here when this town was nothing but a trading post and a dream. I know it'll be here long after both of us are under the ground." He started walking toward the cemetery gate, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I followed, my hand resting on the radio at my belt out of habit more than necessity. "The thing you have to understand," Ezra said, "is that some places are thinner than others. The boundary between what is and what might be, between the world we know and the world we pretend doesn't exist. Millbrook is one of those places. Always has been." We stopped at the gate, wrought iron painted black and starting to rust at the joints. Beyond it, the town spread out in the valley below us, smoke rising from chimneys, cars moving along the streets like toys in a miniature railroad set. "The dog isn't causing the deaths," Ezra continued. "It's announcing them. Like a town crier, but for endings instead of beginnings. Some places need that kind of sentinel, especially places where the dead don't rest easy." I asked him what he meant by that, but he was already walking away, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his coat. Over his shoulder, he called back, "Check your records, Sheriff. Check how many of those deaths were peaceful. Check how many left loose ends." That night, I stayed late at the office, spreading my files across the desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. 43 sightings, 38 deaths. I'd always focused on the when and the where, but Ezra's words made me look closer at the who and the how. The Hendricks family, carbon monoxide poisoning. The investigation had been routine, case closed within a week. But I remembered now that Jim Hendricks had been having problems with his business partner, something about missing inventory and accusations of theft. Problems that died with him, unresolved. Tommy Brennan, car accident, blood alcohol just under the legal limit. But Tommy had been on his way to confront his brother about money that had gone missing from their mother's account while she was in the nursing home. Confrontation that never happened. The bride's father, massive heart attack. But he'd been planning to expose safety violations at the mill where he worked, violations that might have shut the place down and cost half the town their jobs. Information that died with him. I pulled out file after file, death after death, and the pattern became clear. The dog didn't appear before just any tragedy. It appeared before deaths that left things undone, secrets untold, justice unserved. Like it was drawn to the weight of unfinished business. The realization made my coffee taste like ash in my mouth. It was 3 weeks later when I saw the dog myself. I was driving home from a domestic disturbance call. The Pattersons fighting again. Nothing serious, just neighbors who'd learned to hate each other over the course of 30 years, when I spotted it in my headlights. Middle of Main Street, sitting perfectly still like it was waiting for a bus that would never come. I stopped the cruiser 50 feet away and watched it through the windshield. It was bigger than any dog had a right to be, easily the size of a small pony, with fur so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its eyes caught my headlight beam and threw it back like mirrors, but wrong somehow, as if the light was coming back changed. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, without any warning, without any movement I could detect, it was gone. Not ran away, not trotted off into the shadows. Just gone, like someone had erased it from the world. I sat there in the cruiser, engine running, heater blowing warm air that suddenly felt cold against my skin. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I couldn't make them stop. The next morning, Ezra Thorne was found dead in his garden, apparently of natural causes. Doc Phillips said it looked like his heart had simply stopped. No trauma, no signs of struggle. Peaceful as could be. But when I went through his house as part of the routine investigation, I found things that made me question what I thought I knew about the man. Books, mostly. Old books, the kind with leather bindings and titles in languages I couldn't read. Books about folklore and mythology, about creatures that existed in the spaces between belief and disbelief. And in the margins, notes written in Ezra's careful handwriting. Notes about Millbrook, about the history of the valley, about things that had happened here long before the town had a name. There was a journal, too, leather-bound and filled with dates and observations going back decades. Sightings of the black dog in other places, other towns, always followed by death, always connected to secrets and unfinished business. Ezra had been tracking it for most of his adult life, following it from place to place like some kind of supernatural anthropologist. The last entry in the journal was dated the day before he died. The dog has accepted me. I can feel it now, the weight of what I've carried for so long. Margaret, I'm sorry. I should have told them the truth about what happened that night in Portland. Should have told them it wasn't an accident. But I was scared, and young, and I thought I could carry the secret forever. The dog knows. It's been waiting for me to admit what I'd done, and now I have. In my way. To these pages, if not to the world. Maybe that's enough. Maybe now I can rest. I closed the journal and sat in Ezra's kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a life lived in pursuit of something most people would call impossible. Outside, the sun was setting over the ridge, painting the sky the color of old blood. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking, but it sounded normal, ordinary. The kind of bark that meant dinner was late or a stranger was walking by. That was 15 years ago. Since then, I've seen the dog 7 more times. Each sighting followed by death within days, each death leaving behind questions that would never be answered, confessions that would never be made, apologies that would never be spoken. I've stopped trying to catch it. Stopped trying to warn people when I spot it in their vicinity. What would I tell them? That a supernatural harbinger has marked them for death because they're carrying secrets too heavy for the living world to bear? That their unfinished business has attracted the attention of something that exists to settle accounts? Instead, I've made my peace with it. With the dog, with the deaths, with the knowledge that some things can't be explained or stopped or fixed. I've learned to recognize the signs in myself, the weight that comes from carrying too much truth for too long. That's why I'm telling this story now, speaking it into this recorder in my office while the town sleeps around us. Because I saw the dog again last night, sitting in my front yard, patient as stone. And this time, when our eyes met, I felt something I'd never felt before, recognition. Not fear, not curiosity, but the simple acknowledgement that passes between old acquaintances. The dog knows what I know. About the Morrison boy who didn't die in that hunting accident back in '89 like everyone believes. About the fire at the Westfield farm that wasn't caused by faulty wiring. About all the small lies and large silences that make up the hidden history of this town, the secrets I've kept in the name of peace, order, and the greater good. I can feel the weight of them now, heavier than they've ever been. Heavier than any man should have to carry alone. So I'm setting the record straight, speaking the truth into the darkness while I still can. Because the dog is waiting, and I've learned enough about how this works to know that fighting it is like fighting the tide. You can struggle all you want, but in the end, the water goes where the water goes. The black dog of Millbrook isn't evil, exactly. It's just necessary. Like grief, like justice, like the slow erosion that eventually brings down mountains. It serves a function in the grand scheme of things, maintaining a balance that most of us are too busy living to notice. And maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing that there's something out there keeping accounts, ensuring that nothing truly ends until everything has been settled, is a kind of comfort. Maybe the fact that secrets can't hide forever, that truth has its own gravity, and eventually pulls everything toward it, means something in a world that often feels random and cruel. I don't know. I'm just a small-town sheriff who's seen too much, and carried too much, and lived too long with the weight of what I know. But I can tell you this. The next time someone in Millbrook reports seeing a big black dog where no dog should be, they won't be lying or imagining things. They'll be witnessing something older than the town, older than the valley, older than the very idea of secrets themselves. And somewhere, somehow, justice will be served. The recording device is still running, and I can hear my own breathing in the silence that follows. Outside, the wind is picking up, rattling the windows of the sheriff's office like it's trying to get in. Or maybe like it's trying to let something out. I think I'll leave this tape where someone can find it, along with my files and my records and all the evidence I've gathered over the years. Let whoever comes after me decide what to do with it. Let them decide whether the black dog of Millbrook is something to fear or something to understand. Me? I'm going home. Going to sit on my front porch and wait for whatever comes next. And if I see a familiar shape sitting in my yard, patient as stone and black as midnight, I think I'll be ready for the conversation we've been postponing for far too long. Some things can't be outrun forever. End of recording.